Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Today is Sunday, August the 14th, 2022, and we are here to discuss the world. This is a conversation meant for interaction, so if you have any questions for our lovely guest, Agent Smith, tag me in the chat and I'll pass it along. Agent Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing fine. Can't complain.
Yeah, well, you want to complain?
No.
Okay.
No, I can't complain when I'm full of pizza.
Ah, what kind of pizza?
Like what store or what kind of pizza?
What kind of pizza?
What kind of pizza? Let's see. There was some thin crust pepperoni pizza with mushrooms and Alfredo sauce.
Oh.
And there was double pepperoni with onions and jalapenos. And then there was, what was it? Pepperoni, mushrooms, with garlic parmesan, with extra sauce and extra cheese.
Oh, that one sounds fancy.
Well, it was my grandmother's birthday, so we had a lot of people over.
Nice.
But yeah, pretty good. I'm sated.
Glad you had a proper feast.
Yeah. Yeah, I had to get up a little early so I could do the walk before it.
Aha! He's still sticking to it. Proud of you.
Yeah. It's very uncomfortable. It's been very hot here in Dallas. Yeah.
Ooh, you get extra tokens for beating the heat elementals.
Well, yeah, maybe hold back on the extra tokens. It was partly my fault. I didn't exactly dress for the occasion. I just kind of, without thinking about it, I just kind of went out with sweatpants and a black t-shirt.
You get actually extra tokens for that. You're like, come at me, son. Absorb as much heat as possible and keep it in with these pants. And it's like, you're in Texas. What are you doing?
Yeah, really. So I'll try not to do that next time.
Chat says Agent Smith is one of the reasons I tune into this stream. There was also another person earlier today who was saying that they just got a job as a cook and they had Agent Smith on just audibly in the kitchen last week. And there were other cooks in the kitchen who were commenting on what was being said. So that was pretty cool.
Well, hopefully positive feedback.
Agent Smith being streamed to kitchens near you. I've had a pretty solid week, pretty good stuff. The guild is doing well. We did a brief summary of this past expansion and how it went for us and that kind of a thing. We walked our characters around the world a little bit, had a good time reminiscing. The next expansion is coming out September 26th, which is a day before my brother's birthday. So we'll do that full degenerate grind up to the max level as fast as possible and then be able to do the heroics and things like that. But that's been going well. StarCraft is good. I'm still doing 100 burpees per day. I'm on day 56. So that's been an interesting thing. I didn't expect to be going for that for as long as I have. I was thinking I'll get to 20, I can do it. And I was like, okay, maybe I'll just do 30 days. And I've just consistently been doing the 100.
Well done.
Yeah.
How's your body holding out?
Well, it basically ascended from the point where I would feel really sore at the end of the day and I would feel sore during the first sets the next day. But I no longer feel sore from them, and I've started to try and do it for time instead of just like get the 100 every time. So I can do 100 in about 9 minutes and 20 something seconds. So we're getting there. I want to be a motherfucking athlete again. Let's go.
StarCraft makes you an athlete, doesn't it?
Yeah, an esport athlete, but it doesn't really help your cardio unless you're hyperventilating. which does happen.
Fair point.
Yeah. So this week, the big ticket item that people have been asking about in chat already is the Mar-a-Lago house documents,
Yeah.
FBI. That one, it
Yeah.
seems like it's a little bit spicy, but there's, as always with Mr. Trump, some misinformation going around with it. People say all kinds of shit. So what actually happened and is going on?
Well, basically, there's been a long running back and forth between Trump and federal authorities regarding issues surrounding archived materials and classified materials. So, presidents have to adhere to a lot of rules about the materials, paperwork, gifts, what have you, that they're supposed to save
Mm-hmm.
and store properly. And there were accusations pretty much throughout the Trump administration that the administration was not observing those rules. There was the famous accusation that Donald Trump himself had supposedly tried to flush some kind of memo or something down the toilet. So supposedly there was some materials that he and his administration were supposed to archive that they did not, and which Trump himself had retained. And so that was at issue. Also, supposedly, there were classified materials that Trump had taken with him when he left the White House that he was not supposed to take, since
Mm-hmm.
they were classified materials. So the FBI had been looking at that. I think the National Archives were also involved for their part. And there were requests that he basically turn over the relevant documents. And some of them were turned over. I think more so the documents relevant to the National Archives. But I haven't heard anything to the effect that he was returning the classified documents. At least I don't think so yet. So the FBI was particularly concerned about that, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
So they issued several requests that he turn them over, and he said no. Well, he didn't say no. That's not the lawyerly answer. His lawyers, who would have been the ones to do it, basically found reasons not to, or delayed, or what have you. But eventually, from what I've read thus far, and we don't have all of the details yet, the FBI received a tip. And supposedly the tip was from somebody from Trump's inner circle regarding the presence of those classified materials. And so, predicated on that and a concern that perhaps Donald Trump might try to destroy the evidence, or his lawyers might destroy the evidence, or what have you, the FBI then got a warrant by which they were able to raid his home. Is Mar-a-Lago really his home, or is that just
I think it's
a
one of his
hotel?
properties.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it
that
would
was my
be a
impression.
home for him, but I don't know if it's his main residence.
Yeah. Well, regardless, that's what they got the warrant for, and so that's what they raided. And supposedly they did retrieve some, if not all, of the documents that they were looking for. Supposedly, I don't know that that's been confirmed yet either. But at first, the warrant was sealed, and Donald Trump's people said that the whole thing was just a case of the justice system being politicized or weaponized. I think has become the term popular amongst his supporters. And so there were accusations that the whole thing was just an excuse to try to make Donald Trump look bad and to try to build a fake case against him so that he could be convicted on trumped up charges, so to speak, so as to prevent him from running for president. But as it happens, the FBI was pretty quick to unseal the warrant after the raid, and statements made by the FBI director when they did that suggested that they were very cognizant of the fact that the FBI was being accused of being biased in their choice of raiding the estate, Donald Trump's estate at Mar-a-Lago. And they wanted to try to dispel any notion that they were just trumping up charges as part of some kind of conspiracy to go after him. They wanted to illustrate that there were substantive charges. He also wanted to make the point that Donald Trump had had several opportunities to turn over the documents so as to avoid the raid, and that they had chosen not to. He also made the point that Donald Trump actually could have effectively unsealed, so to speak, the warrant himself and had chosen not to do so. So, in part, it seems Donald Trump and his team were trying to take well, maybe not create an excuse, but take an opportunity to try to make it look like he was being persecuted, to score some political points, which was pretty effective overall. But the FBI was aware that was going on, and so they wanted to try to unseal that warrant pretty quickly, which is what they did. So from what we know from the warrant, some of the specific documents mentioned included nuclear documents. I haven't read anything, well, maybe I haven't read enough about it to know whether they're talking specifically about nuclear weapons or nuclear energy or just what kinds of nuclear-related documents that they were after, but it had something to do with nuclear. And so those documents were classified, and they wanted to get those. There were other classified documents as well, from what I've read, but I don't remember the details about them. The nuclear documents in particular have been the ones people have been talking about. As far as specific laws that may have been broken, there were 3 listed in the warrant. One of them was unlawful removal of government records. That speaks for itself. There were classified documents that they weren't supposed to take, and allegedly they took them. And apparently they had them, so that seems like a pretty well justified grounds for a warrant there. Another law listed was a law regarding the destruction of records, specifically to obstruct a government operation. Again, I think that refers to the rumors, which may have been confirmed by the informant that was sending information to the FBI, that Trump and his team may have at various points, or may soon, destroy some of the evidence, or documents rather, that the FBI was seeking that were in storage on Trump's property. And then the third one was the Espionage Act. This is the one that people online have been talking about. So the Espionage Act was passed way back when the United States was in World War II, or not World War II, when World War I, rather. And that regards basically the illegal divulgence of classified material of one sort or another. So you can see how all of these would be relevant, given the substance of the case.
Mm-hmm.
Now, whether or not any of this actually goes anywhere is actually still debatable. That's not entirely clear right now. The situation in general is unprecedented. Like, this has never happened before, where you have a former president being investigated for keeping classified materials illegally. Mm-hmm. So there's nothing really we can point to and say, okay, this is what it's going to look like. We have no pre-existing model. So it's hard to judge whether or not any charges will actually be filed, or if they are, what would happen after that, just how likely a conviction would be, or what have you. Mm-hmm. So that said, it could also be that the Attorney General is not actually even looking to file charges. One of the theories I read is that actually they were just trying to get the documents back, and that they may just sort of leave things there. Mm-hmm. Where they are now, rather than trying to pursue further charges. Maybe that's because they don't think they have a strong enough case, if that's what they end up doing, or maybe they just recognize the unprecedented nature of this and don't really want to get caught up into it. Because if this does go to trial, then it's going to be a really long, difficult, complex trial, given the weird, unprecedented nature of it. Mm-hmm. So it may be that the Attorney General would just as soon avoid that and would prefer to just say, okay, we got the documents back, they're secure, problem solved. As far as previous examples of convictions over things like this, Espionage Act violations or unlawful removal of government records, from what I was reading, prosecutors generally look for particularly egregious examples of the law being broken in this regard, of these laws being broken specifically, before they'll actually pursue charges. So generally they're looking at things like intentional mishandling. I'm reading from my notes here. Intentional mishandling, involvement of vast quantities of material and its exposure or indications of disloyalty. So that's specifically the quote from the article I read on this. So those are more what they're looking for here. And I don't know that Trump necessarily ticks those boxes. So even if he's technically broken the law, the Attorney General may not pursue it just because there's not a clear-cut case in these regards. Like there may not be clear enough evidence for these specific types or these specific contexts such that they would get a slam dunk case. So that's pretty much where we are now. It's still early, so maybe charges get filed, maybe not, but that's more what people are kind of waiting to see. If I had to guess, I would say no, and even if they do, I don't think it'll go anywhere. It'll be such a long trial that Donald Trump will probably get the chance to run for president again, well before they're anywhere near a conclusion.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, if he becomes president again, then he can get his own guy in charge of the Department of Justice. And at that point, he could lean on him to drop the case, which would not be legal, but that's never really been a barrier before for him. Even if it doesn't work, even if the Department of Justice does go forward and get a conviction against Donald Trump, if he's president, he could argue that he's immune. And I'm not entirely sure about the details of the way the law works out on that, but given the wide discretion that the law generally gives sitting executives, that may well be an effective argument. So at that point, the only thing you could really do is impeachment, which of course doesn't really work against Donald Trump. He's buffed against impeachment, you might say. So if they're going to get him for anything, they're probably going to have to do it before 2024 and the election they're in. Maybe he runs and he loses. In that case, it doesn't really matter. But even then, I think it's debatable whether or not they could even get a charge in that case, really. But yeah, that's pure speculation on my part, and that's all in the future. And I might add here, I'm not a lawyer. This is not my wheelhouse. I kind of have to take the information on subjects like this from other sources of media rather than from my own background. So trust what I'm saying here for what it's worth. Maybe that's a good time for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. Sometimes more obvious than at other times. So if I ever say anything stupid, biased, or wait.
Wrong, stupid, or biased.
Wrong, stupid, or biased, thank you. If I ever say anything that's wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So chat is encouraged to participate in that regard. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. Yeah, it's always fun learning from chat. Including learning monetary policy from Fuzzy Cord. He's pretty good. Yeah, if he could teach me sometime, I'd appreciate it. We didn't really learn it that much in grad school. It wasn't like the main thing we studied. Mm-hmm. So some of the nuances of money supply are still a little tricky for me. Every time I think I understand it, I trip over something new. There's some specific context or nuance that I was missing.
It's almost like learning a lot about any one thing takes a whole bunch of time and energy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of one things in economics.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty broad field. But that's pretty much all I have on the Trump thing. I don't think anything will really come of it. I don't doubt that it'll be no small source of drama for the foreseeable future, but most likely, as with most of the other examples of Trump drama, most of his detractors will most likely be disappointed, I suspect. Mm-hmm. And in the meantime, he himself and his team will no doubt spin it into political gold, as they've already been doing. Are there any other hot ticket items you wanted to get to?
I think that was the big one that I saw. Chat, was there anything else that was like pretty dank that we need to cover? Espionage is spicy, so that one stood out in the news for sure.
I think we already talked about the Inflation Reduction Bill. That was last time, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. I'm not sure what other hot and sexy events people are interested in. Didn't really have too much written down for this week. It
Oh,
was,
I did have one thing.
oh yeah.
So, what do you think the chances are that the Vietnamese currency becomes the foremost and most used in the world?
Odds are pretty slim, Neuro.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be crazy if the currency was dong? Someone in chat wanted me to say that. Yep. Thank you, Old
Gotcha.
Dirty, for the reminder.
No, pretty unlikely. I think English speakers are safe.
Okay. The chip
And
bill.
oh, the chip bill. Yeah, I did have notes on that. It had some interesting bits in it. Have you heard of this?
No.
So basically, this is the. I've talked a little bit about it, but I didn't get into too many details before because I kind of wanted to see what the final form of the bill would be. But this is a bill that's been in negotiation for the past year, roughly. And it's had different names in that time. I was calling it USA Competes for a long time. That was the. I want to say that was the House bill, or maybe it was the Senate bill version. I don't recall. But the idea was just to try to shovel federal money into semiconductors, specifically the manufacturing of microchips. And the idea was to basically de facto have an industrial policy backing the industry so that the United States could remain competitive in that industry. Because the United States used to be a market leader, or more accurately, US firms used to be market leaders in semiconductors and microchips and whatnot. But over the past couple decades, they've lost that lead. At this point, the countries with the firms that are the principal market leaders are Taiwan and South Korea, I believe, are the main ones. The US is still up there. We still have Intel and whatnot, but they're not nearly as dominant as they were back in like the 80s, 90s, and whatnot. So the US government is concerned about the Chinese government dumping money into its microchips industry. And they've been making some strides into developing a modern microchips industry that would allow them to be independent of imports. Because right now, if you want to build anything in China that has microchips in it, odds are you're going to need to import quite a few of those microchips. Again, Taiwan, South Korea, and to a lesser extent, the United States and a few other countries are the principal producers of microchips, especially top of the line microchips. And so inherently, then, if you want to build top notch stuff, then you're going to have to import from them. Now, if quality is not as much of an object, that's not really a problem. China's semiconductor industry has pretty much already reached a point where they can produce microchips of sufficient sophistication that is to say, their manufacturers can already build stuff with semiconductors and microchips in it that don't need as much power. So they've already made it that far. But that's far enough to get the US government, at least, as well as European governments and Japan, concerned that if action is not taken, then the advantage that Western manufacturers, and I include Taiwanese and South Korean manufacturers in that, the gap between them is going to close. So they would like to maintain that gap for as long as possible, or perhaps even indefinitely if they can. And since, Chinese researchers are smart, they're going to make advancements over time. That means that Western companies have to invest in new technologies that will allow them to maintain that edge. And so the US government wanted to negotiate this bill and pass this bill so as to ensure that the US government was taking action as far as helping fund research and development and also helping fund construction of fabrication units in the United States. Since in addition to wanting to maintain the Western edge over Chinese manufacturers of microchips, They also wanted relatively more of existing global microchip capacity to be located more in the United States. So it's partly not just a research and development bill or a China competition bill, it's also partly a supply chain bill. There is a shortage of microchips, so you can kind of point to that and say that was the impetus, but not really. I mean, it hasn't really been that big of an issue before. I think really the issue is that U.S. politicians want more jobs in their districts. I would note that one of the senior politicians, I think in the Senate, who sits on one of the Senate committees that was most relevant to the negotiation of this bill, is going to benefit from the construction of one of Intel's new fabrication plants in his district in Ohio. And I don't think that's an accident. There are lots of places you can build fabrication units. You don't necessarily need to build them in Ohio. Certainly not in that particular district represented by that particular politician. So that's just kind of what you get with industrial policy. There's invariably always political shenanigans that go on kind of behind the scenes, which is why economists in general are pretty skeptical of industrial policy. That's not to say there are not people who think it's a good idea within certain context and within certain limitations, and certainly it's been done effectively in the past. I don't think anybody would, or at least should, argue that it has no place in modern policymaking. But that said, there are so many pitfalls with industrial policy. It's probably better to avoid it if you can. Sometimes you can't, but sometimes you can, and when you can, you probably should. Because the most likely outcome with any given industrial policy is, one, failure, and two, endemic corruption. Because generally there's a lot of money behind any given industrial policy. And because a lot of people get jobs out of projects that are born out of industrial policy, there's a ready-made constituency that wants to continue voting in politicians that maintain existing industrial policy, if not advocate for expansion of industrial policy. Now, if industrial policy is successful and produces self-sufficient, profitable firms, that's not a big deal, but a lot of the time it doesn't. And the result is that you have large industries dependent on state subsidies that soak up more money from the government than they pay back in taxes. And that results in a sustained net drain from government coffers, which can be quite debilitating if you build up a whole lot of firms like that are just always taking government money but are not self-sufficient and generating profits. This was a big problem in places like Latin America in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. There was a lot of impetus put on import substitution development strategies, wherein they would try to limit imports of finished goods so as to create space for indigenous manufacturers to emerge. But the trouble was that those firms were so politically influential that the subsidies and trade protections that they received became the principal backbone of their business strategy. Rather than trying to become globally cost competitive, they would just try to monopolize their own market in so much as they could, using their political connections, and then preventing any more efficient producers from outside the country from competing down prices, and therefore preserving their market share. And the result of that was a sustained drain on government finances that resulted in quite a bit of debt, which worked okay for as long as they could refinance the debt or find new people who were willing to lend them new money. But eventually that ended in the early 1980s when the United States jerked up interest rates to circa 20%. And that was pretty much the death knell for them, because when the United States, which is sort of the baseline most secure market as far as financing, is giving out 20% interest on loans, what results is a massive redistribution of money out of developing markets, which are relatively more risky, and into the US and perhaps also other developed markets, since they generally increase interest rates too. When the US does, that's not uncommon. So the result then is that there's much less capital available to developing countries. So that massive outflow of capital, combined with just debts that had grown to dangerous proportions, it was pretty obvious a lot of that money was not going to get paid off. So between the rock and the hard place, Latin America really got squeezed in the 1980s. There was a cascade of debt defaults all over Latin America in that period, and the result was a pretty long period of suppressed economic growth in the region. Eventually, the only thing that could really end it was a series of negotiations by which haircuts were negotiated. Basically, the people that had lended money to Latin American governments agreed to forgive a certain proportion of the debt and also to basically require lower interest to be repaid. And in exchange, the United States government actually agreed to help those governments pay back the debt. So basically, it was just a massive hemispheric debt restructuring, which was pretty large in scale. I don't know enough finance history to know if it was unprecedented in scale, but it definitely would rank amongst the larger debt restructuring events in the history of finance. Yeah, a lot of governments, well, a lot of people in Latin America were pretty upset about it because I think the United States required structural reforms to economies, which invariably means things like tax cut. Well, maybe not tax cuts. Generally, they ask for tax rises so they can pay off the debt. But government spending is generally cut in the wake, well, as part of structural economic reforms. And so less money will be spent on things like welfare or, the military or whatever, whatever kind of government spending you can think of. And generally that doesn't go over well with people who are generally pretty upset with the lack of public services in general. Because, Latin America most parts of Latin America are still developing. And so there's not exactly a surplus of public services to begin with. So when they get cut, people are particularly upset. And I think Argentina is a particularly good example of that. Maybe Dagneb can comment on that. But yeah, in the 80s, it was a rough time. Eventually, the debts were restructured and the region's finances improved in the 90s. The 90s also helped because there was a big global economic boom, and so that helped commodity prices recover. And since Latin American economies are disproportionately dependent on commodities, that really helped them out. So that worked for a while. Anyway, I don't want to get into like a full financial history of Latin America since the 1980s, but yeah, that import substitution strategy only gets you so far. It can be done, but in a lot of cases, and in particular Latin America is, a good case study of this, it has not worked. Hence the skepticism amongst academics.
There's some people asking about the global implication of the CHIPS Act, because we're getting a lot of chips from Taiwan and things like that. Some people are also mentioning things happening in the Taiwan Strait.
Well, I mean, yeah, China's still sort of saber rattling. They're trying to look big and scary. Although I think they did announce that the war games were officially over. So, that aspect of saber rattling at least is at an end. But yeah, there is some concern from some quarters that the U.S. is disproportionately dependent on imports of Taiwanese semiconductors, well, specifically microchips. And that if China made a move on Taiwan, that could have seriously deleterious effects on the U.S. economy correspondingly. I think from what I read, TSMC, which is the leading and preeminent microchip manufacturer in Taiwan, they apparently do have a plan in the event of a Chinese invasion to basically just wreck all of their equipment. I don't know what stage of the invasion would have to be reached for them to do that. I imagine they would be pretty reluctant unless they were, at the gates, so to speak. But technically, they do have a plan for that. So invading Taiwan is not really a viable strategy for China to try to achieve microchip parity with the West. That's probably not going to work. But I have read some people say that China's government might be tempted, and that itself would be a reason for the United States to try to reshore, so to speak, more microchip manufacturing. So yeah, there is some impetus there. But the thing about that is that, TSMC knows that. They know that there's some strategic geopolitical risk there. They know that supply chains are a little wonky right now, and that they could be wonky again in the future, depending on said geopolitical risks. And I know that U.S. politicians are kind of butthurt, so to speak, about the lack of American market share in the industry. So, as a result of all that, TSMC itself has taken it on its own initiative, I might add, taken it upon itself to build more microchip manufacturing facilities, the fab units in the United States. And I think they're building a big one in Arizona somewhere, maybe in Phoenix. I don't quite remember exactly the location. But they are building those facilities. And so technically, the United States will be producing more of its own microchips once they build that facility, since it's almost certainly going to be used to source chips for the American market.
Does Taiwan not sell chips to China at the same rate as the West?
They do sell a lot, but the thing is, they don't sell their most modern microchips. Yeah, actually, the United States basically doesn't let them sell their most modern microchips. I don't know that they would do it anyway, but the United States used, I think it's called the Foreign Products Rule. The State Department and the Commerce Department have lots of little tools that they use to try to punish companies and or deter companies from doing business with certain actors as a part of various sanctions regimes. So one of the things the U.S. government can do is it can say that if a given business sells to a sanctioned entity, then that that business will itself become sanctioned. That's called secondary sanctions. That's not uncommon. But in the case of Taiwan, I think the foreign product rule is more relevant. So the foreign product rule basically says that anybody, even if they're an overseas firm that isn't even in the United States, anybody who makes a product that uses American inputs, be it physical inputs or software or whatever, those firms cannot sell to certain sanctioned entities without being locked out of the U.S. market. So we can't necessarily punish the firm itself because it's a foreign firm, but we can tell their American suppliers to cut them off, which would be very disruptive, obviously. So the foreign direct product rule is pretty effective, especially for firms that have strong ties to the United States. And TSMC actually buys most of its capital equipment from the Netherlands, and it gets a lot of other materials from places like Japan or South Korea. But the software on the capital equipment they use, as well as a lot of the intellectual property that they use as part of their designs, are American in origin. And so that's, in this case, where the American connection comes in, and that's where the American leverage is located. So TSMC, as a result, is basically forbidden by the U.S. government from selling their most modern chips in the Chinese market. And that those threats have value. They have successfully deterred TSMC from doing that. So yes, Taiwan and TSMC, they do sell chips to China, but it's mostly their older stuff that they sell, as I understand it. Yeah, the US uses that same foreign product rule to try to deter, I think it's called ASML. It's a Dutch manufacturer that produces the capital equipment that is used to produce the most modern cutting-edge microchips. If you can't buy the most modern microchips, you can just buy the factory equipment that's used to make the most modern factory chips and then just make it yourself. And that fact is not lost on anybody, up to and including the United States government. And so they went out of their way to make sure that the manufacturer of that equipment is itself deterred from selling to China by way of the foreign product rule. The US government has also been leaning on the Dutch government to try to pass its own rules that would restrict the sale of cutting edge equipment to China. But the Dutch government has been pretty reluctant to do that thus far. I think they have started considering it more seriously in the past year or two. In general, European governments over the past couple years have been taking China more seriously as a strategic rival, whereas before they hadn't been doing that. So there's been more consideration of that in Amsterdam as a result, but I don't think that they've taken any action yet, technically. So for now, it's mostly the United States that's doing the work of deterring sales to China of that modern equipment. So let's see. Oh, we didn't. So to get back to the chips bill. So basically, it's an excuse to give money to chips manufacturers so that they'll build more stuff in the United States. That's sort of the gist of it. Uh, However, that subsidy money comes with certain strings attached. So, for one, if you take subsidy money in order to build manufacturing facilities in the United States, you're actually disallowed from building manufacturing facilities in China. And of course, that's obviously meant to deter firms from building, modern equipment, modern factories and stuff, and modern microchips in China. I don't know how effective that's necessarily going to be. I mean, most firms don't. Well, there is an incentive to build those facilities in China because a lot of the times China will require technology sharing agreements or local partner agreements as a precondition for selling this, that, or the other good in their market. So the Chinese market is obviously very attractive. Firms want to sell there. So they obviously want to meet those preconditions so that they can participate. But if you take the subsidy money, you're not going to be able to do that. So it kind of comes down to a cost benefit analysis. Like if you're expecting most of your growth to come from sales in China, maybe the subsidies then are not a good idea. It might save you some money, but it also is going to cut you off from one of your principal growth markets. But on the other hand, if you're concerned about geopolitical risk, or if you're at a point where you would rather source your factories in other places outside of China because you don't think the Chinese market is really sufficiently open to warrant basing your business strategy around trying to gain access to it, in that case, it would make more sense to take the subsidies. So it's probably going to depend a lot on the firms involved, the individual firms. It's going to depend on sort of their markets, their market share, their technology, etc. But anyway, that is one of the preconditions that they'll have to meet if they do accept. Well, that is one of the conditions they'll have to meet if they want to get the money. Let's see. So another condition that's going to be imposed on firms that take the money, they're not going to be able to use the money they take in order to purchase stock or pay dividends. So that speaks for itself. Obviously, hypothetically, a firm could lie about wanting to build manufacturing facilities in the United States and could just take the subsidy money and then pocket it and use it for other stuff. So the way the law is written, at least as of now, they're not going to be able to do that. If you do take the money to build stuff, then you have to actually build the stuff. You're not going to be able to move the money around and use it for anything else. So let's see. So those are some key conditions that are attached. Let's see. There's also a little research and development funding. It's about $10 billion for the Department of Commerce to do research and development projects. Specifically listed were private-public partnerships and then partnerships between government, industry, and academic institutions. So pretty much prototypical government research and development stuff. It'll probably mostly take the form of grants, I would expect. I didn't read anything to that effect, but I assume that they're just going to give out grants to academics to try to do that to do research that is relevant to this, that, or the other strategic area. Probably, in this case, areas relating to technologies that are used to produce microchips, presumably. It might also involve other areas. AI is a popular target for industrial policy of one kind or another. Quantum computing is another one. There's a lot of interest in hydrogen as a source of power, but I don't know that this bill is really that interested in energy. So I'm not sure if they'll target that. But anyway, this strategic sectors basically will receive, well, academics studying strategic sectors anyway will probably get a little bit of that money there. Interestingly, they also have a little section in the bill carved out for economic development. So this is, definitely an example of industrial policy. They're trying to economically develop certain regions of the country that have not really benefited much from the tech sector, broadly speaking, and the growth that it's generated over the past couple decades. A lot of that growth has been concentrated in the largest metropolitan areas. Obviously, the Bay Area in California, Boston, maybe Dallas to a lesser degree, or one of the smaller nodes in that network. But yeah, I mean, in general, there are certain parts of the country where economic growth from the tech sector has been particularly concentrated. And some economists have argued that the government should try to diversify that growth by creating this, that, or the other government incentive for businesses of one kind or another to locate in those sort of underserved areas. So specifically what they're going to do here is dedicate $1 billion to what they call a recompete pilot program. And the idea there is, well, according to the article, it's going to be designed to support persistently distressed communities with economic development activities. So basically, they're just going to try to incentivize businesses to locate there. Again, I haven't read specific details, and they may not even have specific details as to how they're actually going to operationalize this yet. It may fall to administrative agencies to actually design the specific plan. And they may not have done that yet, but I strongly suspect that it's going to come in that form. So let's see. Oh, yeah, and a final note here. Well, not a final note, but another thing they're going to do is dedicate some money to ORAN development. So this is sort of a framework for, I want to say, telecommunications technology. Right now, telecommunications technology is generally produced by individual firms, and as a result, the technology is generally proprietary. So if you buy one piece of equipment, telecommunications equipment from one firm, generally you're going to be buying a lot of other equipment from that firm because there's not really a lot of interoperability between pieces of equipment from different firms. Now, this is a concern for the United States, if not the West generally, because Huawei produces a lot of telecommunications equipment. And there's concern that they may get a big advantage in terms of dominating the developing world and the markets they're in. Huawei has already been cut out basically from developed markets, so it's not really as much of a concern there. But it's possible that they could dominate developing markets because generally they have a cost advantage. The equipment isn't bad by any stretch. But Western governments are concerned about things like spying, espionage, and they also want to try to slow down the development of the telecommunications sector in China so that it doesn't end up basically denying, Western equivalents to markets. So in order to try to do that, what they've done is they developed, or are trying to develop anyway, a framework for the development of telecommunications equipment by which that equipment would be interoperable between different firms. And so that's called ORAN. I don't remember specifically what the acronym stands for. I think it's like open source something. I don't remember exactly. But they've been trying to push this basically as a way to compete with China. They're hoping that even if Western firms may not be able to compete on every product with China, they're hoping that fact with an open source system basically will mean that they don't automatically lose the entire market to Chinese firms just because they dominate particular sectors or particular product categories rather. So there's a $1.5 billion in the bill dedicated for that. Let's see, there's also a couple other items here. There's a tax credit, and that's going to be an investment tax credit for chip plants. And it's going to be worth about $24 billion, according to my notes here. So basically, if you're building a plant, you'll be able to get 25% off, so to speak, of the total value of the investment. And it also includes some other little incentives here and there, but that's sort of the main aspect of it. Let's see, there's also some funding authorizations here, $200 billion for 10 years, well, $200 billion over 10 years, rather, mostly for research activities. I should say, when I say funding authorizations, these are for the National Science Foundation and the Department of Energy's Office of Science. So both of these offices, or agencies, I guess, do a lot of research into key technologies. It's pretty common. So those research funds, such as they are going to be supercharged over the next 10 years. Or at least they're going to get a lot of new money. You know, $200 billion is pretty good.
They're
So,
supercharging the science agents.
yeah, there you go.
Let's go.
Supercharging the science agents. Well, they're also going to expand the National Science Foundation's work. They're just going to kind of broaden the categories of stuff that they can operate in. And they're also going to establish regional technology hubs. Again, that's part of that development strategy, so that it can kind of spread economic development from technology research around into areas of the country that have not really benefited that much from the technology sector that much over the past couple decades. Let's see. There's also going to be more money for STEM education. That's not unusual. And trying to reach underserved communities, hiring veterans for STEM careers, fighting sexual harassment in science. You know, it's the usual kind of stuff you would expect, basically. $20 million for the enhanced security protection for U.S. Supreme Court justices. That kind of speaks for itself. And a new authorization for NASA, so that can continue to be a thing. So that's pretty much the gist of it. So all in all, it's a pretty decent bill. Incentivizing production of fabrication units in the United States, that's obviously a big plus, you know. And they're subsidizing the investment rather than, say, production or what have you, or just giving them money. So that's a preferable approach, since otherwise you end up kind of distorting market decisions, generally in a negative way. I have read some criticism that, you know, even by just doing investment, they're possibly encouraging overproduction of microchips, since more production facilities may be built now than maybe were originally planned, and so that could cause a crash in the market later once that production really reaches capacity. That may be a problem that may be the kind of problem that you want to have. You may prefer to have lots of, you know, a high degree of production in the United States of microchips that are then cheap, but the trouble then is more medium to long term, wherein the microchip firms basically may find it difficult to get enough of a return from production in order to justify further investment, either in production or in research and development. And in that case, firms may fall behind technologically, even more than they already have in the United States. So that's maybe not the best thing. I might also add that the US government has been kind of ambiguous about the exact objective here, because on the one hand, it's, you know, lovely that they want to make more microchips in the United States, but there's more than one type of microchip. In fact, there's a lot of different categories, and it's not clear what specific types they want built here in the United States. You know, maybe they say all of them, but that's kind of a broad remit there. That's probably not going to happen. So it's not clear to me exactly what kinds of microchips are actually going to be produced at the fabrication plants that are being built. And it may be that if it's just one specific kind, then the United States secures its supply chain for that specific kind, but is actually still vulnerable to potential geopolitical risk that may affect the supply of other types of microchips. In which case, this CHIPS bill and the current reshoring effort are not really going to have had the desired effect. But then it may be that if they actually do want to produce all of the different types of microchips here, it would just be cost prohibitive. You know, the government just may not have either the money to do that, or even if they have the money, maybe not the political will to spend all of that money in order to try to secure supply chains in all of the different categories. So if it's the case that we're not really building a very broad range of microchips as a result of this bill, then it's going to be mostly a political event. It's not actually going to change that much about the structure of the market, where the supplies are coming from, or U.S. market share in the market. It's going to be something that politicians can point to and say, hey, we did a thing.
We made
Vote for
jobs.
us. Yeah, we made jobs. We're producing marginally more microchips of a very particular type in a particular category. So that is a good thing. Vote me. So that's not really, that's kind of more of a lateral move strategically, so not that effective. But economically, it'll at least have some impact, some positive impact. So people may like that and will vote them back in. And in so much as it's a political bill, then it'll have served its purpose. So just how all of this stuff, not only in the CHIPS bill, but a lot of the stuff in the Inflation Reduction Bill actually gets operationalized, that remains to be seen. So we'll have to watch how that pans out and how effective or ineffective those specific plans end up being. We shall see. Yeah,
Ready for a post-pizza nap.
we had some other stuff too. So yeah, I am pretty zonked, especially staying up late. I wanted to go to bed early, but then I ended up staying up late trying to organize notes. Been taking a lot of notes lately on Indian politics. It's a very challenging, complex country to study.
Yeah, it's a big country.
Yeah. So I've been looking at state level politics instead of national politics. And I've been learning a lot just from that, really. Yeah, caste really is important in India's politics. There's a lot of pandering to caste groups, and apparently that's a very effective approach. It seems to work. So the other major driver that I noticed was personality. Like a lot of political parties do not really live or die by ideology or policy, but rather based off of their ability to appeal to people of a given caste background and their ability to have a charismatic leader whom is sufficiently attractive to people, either by dint of, how should I put this? Their ability to appear faithful. Religiosity is important in Indian politics, as well as Indian society in general. So if you can make yourself look like a guru or at least some kind of religious figure, or if not even that, then at least very pious, that's
Specifically
generally
as
a
a
vote
Hindu,
winner.
or
Yeah, Hindus are sort of more so Hinduism, yeah. I mean, that's like 80 to, what is it, 80% of the country. So that's, if you're going to do it, that's pretty much what you have to do. Yeah, Muslims kind of behave similarly. Muslim voters, I should say, in India. I mean, really any group. I mean, just Muslims are basically just another caste in India. All the more so since most of them were part of caste conversions. In general, in India, when people converted to Islam, it was generally because their caste group converted to Islam. And so mass conversions like that were not unusual. But the thing is, if your whole caste group converts, then everybody kind of knows who you are, right? One of the appeals of converting is that in Islam, there's no caste system, whereas in Hinduism, there is. So people think, oh, I'll convert to Islam, and then they won't know I won't have a caste, and they'll have to treat me equally. But the thing is, it's only really people of low caste that think like that. Like if you're a high caste or a medium caste, it's not that appealing a prospect.
yeah,
So
you
if
could even
you,
feel like you're going to lose something if you
yeah,
switch.
exactly. So if your caste group converts, then all of the other high caste and medium caste people kind of know that as a Muslim, you're probably actually descended from people who are low caste. And so they kind of keep that in mind, right? So you're not really
Ah,
escaping anything.
yeah.
It's also worth mentioning, too, that even within Islamic communities in India, there is actually implicit caste. People are supposed to treat each other as equals, but in practice, there is kind of a subcaste system within Islamic communities by which certain people who are higher than other people kind of keep their distance and maintain certain customs that separate themselves from the other members of the community. Yeah, caste in India is not really like a Hindu thing per se. It's more of like a mindset. It's almost like a custom. It's something that people carry with them wherever they go, even if they sort of westernize or become educated or convert to other religions that don't have caste systems. they'll still carry the mindset with them. And so they'll still practice certain customs which implicitly uphold caste
How many
without
castes
necessarily
are
meaning
there?
to. That's an interesting question. It depends on if you want to talk about Varna or Jati. So, Varna is the ancient traditional caste system as outlined in the Vedas, which are sort of the ancient holy texts in Hinduism. And there's four of those. So, at the top are the Brahmins, that's sort of the priestly divine caste. And then under them are the Kshatriyas. I think it's the Kshatriyas under them. And those are like the warriors. And under them are the Vaishyas, and I don't quite remember who they were. I think they were like merchants or something. And then under them are the Shudras, and those are sort of laborers and farmers and whatnot. And there's kind of an unofficial fifth caste that wasn't ever written about. Those are the Dalits. They have different names. Dalits are the easiest to remember, so that's generally what I go with. But basically, those are the untouchables. Those are the people who are kind of ostracized from the whole system. And as a result, they're rather maltreated, to put it mildly. They're not. You're not even supposed to touch them because if you so much as touch them, then you get polluted. Ideas of pollution are a big part of the caste system in India. People who are not clean, people who are not pious, they are thought to have a polluting effect on their environment and on the people they interact with. So you're supposed to minimize contact with them. And so because the Dalits are the most polluted, to the point where they're outcasts or pseudo outcasts, since they are still kind of part of the overarching society and economy. Because they're technically the most polluted, they generally receive the most discrimination.
If they're not written about officially, how do you know that you're in that caste?
Oh, people will let you know.
Oh,
Rest assured, people who have higher castes will let you know. People who breach norms and customs that are designed to keep Dalits at a distance, those people are very frequently assaulted, beaten, even killed in India, especially in the most conservative, traditional parts of India.
well,
So, yeah, they let you know. They enforce those norms vigorously in the most conservative parts of India. And really, your own group, your own caste, your own family, and whatnot, they'll tell you as well because they want to keep you out of trouble. Yeah, the rules are pretty strict. Like, you're not even, if you're an untouchable, you're not even supposed to drink from the same well as people from other castes. You're not supposed to touch them. In some cases, you're not supposed to wear shoes around them. I think there was one documentary I saw where untouchables were required when they passed by this one, what was it? It was like a restaurant or a bar or something. Because it was owned by people of higher caste and because people of higher castes used it, untouchables were required to take off their shoes when they walked by. And that was again just part of the whole custom of keeping them at a distance. I think they could actually drink there, but they had to use different glasses. And I think the guy who provided the drinks would not like hand it to them. He would just put it on the counter and they had to pick it up themselves. And intermarriage is a huge no-no. Yeah, in general, intermarriage between different castes is very much taboo. Well, it's maybe not taboo, but it's discouraged. You're supposed to marry within your caste, according to tradition. But marrying somebody who's an untouchable pretty much inherently means you're marrying down. Those people are like way below you. So it's considered very embarrassing to have a family member marry into an untouchable, well, marrying an untouchable, basically. And in the cases where that's happened, generally those are the cases that have ended in violence. Somebody's, especially if it's a girl, somebody's daughter will fall in love with an untouchable boy, like in the next village over or something. And then the family finds out about it and they just throw a huge fit and they'll go out and they'll try to kill the boy or maybe go after the family or maybe even kill the daughter. That's not necessarily unusual either. So yeah, people people will let you know your caste.
is there a way to move up in caste?
Oh, that's another good question. Kind of. There's sort of two ways that you can do it. One way is to get a modern education and then to get a modern job, like in a city. Sort of urban professionals are almost considered a caste unto themselves.
Hmm.
Uh, that's not like a formal thing. They don't have like an official caste designation, and a lot of people who work in cities actually will carry their caste with them, especially if they're Brahmins or something, because Brahmins in particular are very insular. But yeah, I mean, people from outside the cities kind of note that people in cities behave like a caste. Like if you're well educated and you have a decent job, you know, technically you'll say that you don't care about caste. Because invariably modern Indians all say that, I don't really care about that. That's an archaic tradition, what have you. But then frequently they'll only marry people who have a similar mindset, which invariably means people of a similar education, from a similar income bracket, people of a similar background, and people of a similar cultural outlook. So, yes, on the one hand, they're modern people who don't believe in caste, but by doing that, by marrying people specifically who are similar, they're actually sort of replicating caste customs inadvertently. So I'm sure they would argue themselves that, that's not a caste thing, that's just inherent to human nature, blah, blah, blah. That's all true. But it's also kind of part of the endogamy custom within caste. Like you marry people of a similar background
Hmm.
and who practice similar customs. So people from different castes, especially in rural areas, they kind of treat people who are urban professionals as their own separate thing. So that's one way to do it. You can just move to a city, get a modern job, well-paying job, and people will kind of treat you differently there, even if you're technically an untouchable. That's not to say that untouchables, even in urban cities, don't still have problems. They do. But the treatment is better overall. So that's kind of one way to do it. Another way is to have your entire caste be uplifted, to kind of move up the rankings, so to speak. Contrary to what you might think, or to what people listening might think anyway, caste is not fixed. It's more just a marker of your piousness, roughly speaking. Like there are certain customs in India that are considered laudable and prestigious. So, for example, vegetarianism is considered very prestigious. And so, pretty much all Brahmins, all Brahmin castes in India, or at least virtually all of them, practice vegetarianism.
Hmm.
Uh, Reading the Vedas and being familiar with the Vedas, the sort of holy scripture, so to speak, in Hinduism, that's also very prestigious. And various other little customs here and there. They kind of vary from place to place. Knowing the Vedas and vegetarianism are sort of the most common ones nationally, but there's also others. So the more good customs, basically, your caste practices, the more positively it's going to be perceived. And if enough people in a caste start practicing those kinds of prestigious customs, then the caste as a whole can kind of move up the rankings and be more respected. So that's not something you can do as an individual per se, but collectively, if enough people as individuals kind of do that, then everybody kind of benefits.
So it's
And
not
one,
it's not like
go ahead.
written down per se what your caste is when you're born. It's more like behaviorally and socially. What do you tend to do? What is your education level? It's kind of like socioeconomic status with religious steps.
See, that's a tricky thing too, though. And this is kind of where it gets complicated. So, yes, it is definitely something that is implicit. It is partly determined by historical factors. Your caste has customs that are more or less prestigious according to the customs of South Asian civilization. So, yeah, in that sense, it's more about norms and socioeconomics and just kind of a marker of how well people are doing generally as a collective.
Mm.
But it actually is written down. It is actually categorized, and that was something that the British did. The British wanted to bring modern, rationalized governance to India, especially after the company was basically kicked out. Before the British government ran India, it was actually run by the East India Company. So it was kind of a private sector affair at that time. But then it was de facto nationalized by the government because the company rule was considered to be insufficient. if not also inhumane for various reasons. So the British government, once it took over in particular, became much more active in governing India. The company didn't give a shit. There were some efforts to kind of anglicize and change the culture of India under the company, but the company was really much more concerned and interested in profits. Some of the most serious violations of Indian culture and the integrity thereof were more committed after the 1850s when the British government was governing India directly. But anyway, that said, they wanted to rationalize the governance, and one of the things that they tried to do was try to categorize all of these different castes. And so as a result, your caste and your community's caste and your personal caste was all written down by the government, effectively. That was new. Nobody had really done that before in the history of India, because really no administration before in the history of India had had the power to do that. It takes a lot of money to do something like that and a lot of organization and, relatively well-educated and trained bureaucrats. And India's had some, good administration in its history, but the degree of administration required to do something on the level of what the British did was much higher, much greater than the capacity of previous administrations. And also, they didn't really quite have the mindset for it. Maybe that's not the right word, but the idea of systematically creating an ontology of castes that was very much sort of an extension of the logic of creating, lists of different types of species in the animal kingdom, or different categorizations of minerals, that kind of thing. It's the scientific method, basically, as applied to categorization. That is what they tried to do with caste. And so that didn't really exist much in India. That whole perspective, sort of the modern liberal approach to the scientific method and whatnot, that didn't really exist in India before Europeans brought it there. So previous administrations in India not only lacked the capacity, they didn't really have that sort of underlying logic pushing them to do something like that. So the British did, so they went ahead and made the list, and that had it had a big cultural effect, because again, that list had never existed before. So if you have a society that has a caste system by which different groups are ranked according, to various customs that they practice and whatnot, obviously having a list of them all kind of changes the dynamic, because it allows you to enforce that caste and caste norms much more effectively than you could before. Before the list was made, before the British started categorizing castes, the enforcement of caste norms and whatnot, that was enforced more at a local level. And it was done more heuristically. Like, a lot of people didn't really know exactly where they sat on the caste hierarchy. And so there was a little more leeway then in how people treated you and where you were on the hierarchy. The whole system basically was more flexible inherently, especially if you traveled a long distance and you met people of a caste that you'd never heard of before. Well, if all of the castes are listed and, scheduled, so to speak, that's not as much of a problem. So that sort of approach to listing all of the castes and categorizing them, that had the effect of actually empowering some of the most conservative strains of Hinduism. To go on another tangent here, there's always in the history of Hinduism, throughout its history, been a push and pull struggle between very dogmatic conservative Hindus who fervently believe in the caste system and believe in enforcing it, and then on the other side, reformist Hindus who think the caste system is stupid and that it's a terrible blight on humanity and want to get rid of it. So if you think the caste system is terrible, lots of people in India agree with you, and not only that, lots of people in India all throughout history have agreed with you. There have been Hindu reformers going all the way back to thousands of years ago who were trying to fight the caste system. So that's not new. That's a continual struggle within Hinduism that's been ongoing since forever, basically, for as long as there's been a caste system. So when the British made the list, basically, they empowered one particular faction in that struggle, and it was generally the more conservative faction. I don't think they meant to do that. I think the problem is just they didn't really understand Hinduism in the 19th century. Like, it was just too complicated. It was just too big and too diverse, and there were too many different groups and monasteries. Like, in general, the British wanted to treat Hinduism like a single monolithic religion, because that's sort of how they themselves thought. When they thought of religion, they thought of Christianity, Islam, maybe Sikhism, some such. And so they were kind of, when they came to India, looking for similar such institutions. They wanted like fixed structures, like the Hindu equivalent of a church or whatnot, like a monastery. They wanted to find the Hindu equivalent of priests, like existed in Christianity and Islam. So that's more what they were looking for when they tried to understand Hinduism. But the trouble with Hinduism is that while it does have that, it does have monasteries, it does have Hindu priests of one kind or another, those are just one part of Hinduism. Like really, there's no fixed way to do Hinduism. Anybody can be a guru. Anybody can write about Hinduism or comment on the classics and generate new ideas about, philosophy and how Hinduism should be practiced, how the scripture should be interpreted, or even if the scripture is important at all. There's lots of factions within Hinduism that actually don't give much of a shit about the Vedas. They'll say, yes, they're holy and they're valuable, but we don't really care that much. We have other things we'd rather focus on. So the British didn't really understand that about Hinduism, that it was very diverse and that it took many forms. Instead, they kind of homed in on one particular aspect, one particular set of factions that were the most visible, at least from a European perspective. And the trouble with doing that, of course, is that those particular factions, again, were generally more conservative, generally institutionalized Hinduism, so to speak, tends to be relatively more conservative, or at least it was at that time. There have been new institutionalized forms of Hinduism that have emerged since then that have been more liberal in outlook. But especially at that time in the 19th century, when the British were kind of trying to figure out how to govern India, they didn't know that. So the impact they had was to inadvertently make Hinduism a little more conservative and to reinforce the caste system. Now, to be fair to the British, maybe there wasn't anything they could have done to avoid that, because invariably, even if the British hadn't been there, some kind of government in India would have emerged eventually that tried to modernize governance, and modern governance invariably would have meant some kind of census that probably would have involved looking at caste. Now, the other way and the other reason that this is important, including to modern day India, because hypothetically, modern day India could have stopped taking data on caste. Kind of like how France doesn't take census data on minority groups. Like it prefers to just treat everybody as French, rather than trying to break down how many Christians and Muslims there are, or how many people of African descent there are versus European descent. France doesn't do that. So hypothetically, the Indian government after independence could have done that, but they chose not to. So the reason they didn't is because the list of castes ended up being very useful politically for figuring out who the most discriminated groups were, so that those groups could receive special benefits. If you are downtrodden and discriminated against as, say, an untouchable, or one of the other lesser castes in India, the argument could be made that you should benefit from affirmative action to try to offset that discrimination. And there's also a reservation system that was developed in which a certain proportion of seats in government are reserved for people who are untouchables or who are in what are called in India backwards castes. They have a list of scheduled castes that are basically untouchables, and then they have a list of what are called other backwards castes that are not necessarily untouchable, but are also sort of backwards and discriminated against for one reason or the other. Generally, that's more tribal groups, but that's a whole another discussion. But regardless, because this group was discriminated against, it was determined that they deserved special consideration and special treatment. But in order to receive that treatment, the government needs to know what caste you are. And in order to know what caste people are, you need to maintain that list of castes and who's a member of those castes. And as a result, that sort of bureaucratization, so to speak, that categorization and listing of castes that the British started has continued into independent India, because the government does want to know who's in what caste so that it can know who gets what benefits. Now, that's exactly as controversial as you would expect it to be. There's no country on the planet where affirmative action policies are not controversial, so India is no exception. So caste politics regarding affirmative action are pretty much always a thing, and periodically there are riots or protests about it of one kind or another, and there's always jockeying for position. To a degree, it's been argued that some groups who are members of untouchable, some people who are members of untouchable castes actually prefer to remain categorized as untouchable, even if they've, moved to an urban area and live a modern life and are doing well for themselves. They prefer to stay listed as untouchables because it comes with so many benefits that their children could benefit from, or maybe that they could themselves benefit from. And that's controversial, of course, because, technically most Brahmins, who are the highest caste in India, technically most of them are actually very poor, because most people in India still live, well, maybe not at this point, but a lot of the population of India is still rural in nature. I think it's still like pretty close to 50-50 urban rural in India right now. So as a result, most Brahmins, by extension, are also rural. And as a result, by extension, most of them are actually still quite poor. That's not to say that Brahmins don't have disproportionate representation in the higher levels of society, either in the business sector or in the government. They tend to dominate political parties, they tend to dominate industries, they're ubiquitous. Like at the top levels, they're just weirdly common. It's not unusual, basically. So people argue that they're disproportionately privileged and that they should do something. But then, of course, if you're like a Brahmin living in some backwards rural village somewhere, that argumentation doesn't really mean anything to you. And so rural Brahmins and also maybe some upper level caste members in rural areas, a lot of the times they'll protest against affirmative action policies they think are too rigid or that are too favorable to untouchable castes or other lesser castes. But basically, to go back to your original question, yes, actually your caste is written down. And this is why the government has to maintain that sort of registry, so to speak, of castes so that it can know who to give what benefits to. And that registry will probably continue to exist for a long time because lots of voters have very good incentives in terms of those benefits to maintain that system. But that also in turn has the somewhat perverse incentive of continuing the existence of untouchables as a caste, because there is kind of an incentive there to stay in that caste as a group and to maintain its status as untouchable. So the whole caste system in India is very complex. It has lots of moving parts. Like you said, it does have a social element wherein your caste is partly down to perception and is partly down to your socioeconomic status. There is a fair amount of overlap between caste and class in India, but it does go beyond that. There is government programs to help people, and that politicizes caste to a degree that it wasn't politicized before. Caste was part of politics before India became independent, but contrary to what the founders of India wanted, it actually became a greater part of India's politics after independence, rather than lesser, as they had hoped originally. So there's that, but then there's also the fact that, Brahmins are poor mostly and whatnot, so that adds another layer of complexity to it. But yeah, it is both socially recognized, it is partly assigned by your community, but it is also partly assigned by bureaucracy. And to kind of reiterate, that is itself a product of the impact that the modern world has had on the caste system. The caste system is an ancient institution. Invariably, it was going to collide with the modern world eventually. And that collision has resulted in a complex system becoming even more complex. It has resulted in the current sort of politicized 20th century version of the caste system that has emerged. I might add, as an addendum here, that the caste system has evolved like this before. Again, it is not a fixed system. It's always been a dynamic, flexible system. Some of the individual rules are extremely rigid, obviously, especially if you're an untouchable. But how the system works overall, the mobility of different castes, how the castes interact with each other, all of that has changed a great deal depending on era. It's always changed throughout India's history. So the idea that the caste system would be impacted by modernism and urbanization and all these new forces that are at work in Indian society, that's not unprecedented. All of that has happened before. Obviously not, modernization and urbanization per se, but, there have always been new social forces at work in India that have interacted with the caste system in a way that made it change. An example of that would be Buddhism. there was actually a time period, maybe 200 BC or so, or maybe even earlier than that. I don't quite remember exactly, but Buddhism emerged partly as a counterpoint to Hinduism and specifically the caste system. The Hinduism and the caste system, especially way back when, like thousands of years ago, was much more rigid than it is now. And a lot of reformists made efforts to change it, but eventually there was this guy named, Buddha. Actually, that wasn't his name, but we know him as the Buddha, the founder of Buddhism. And part of the argumentation, well, part of the logic behind his argumentation, or maybe more accurately, part of the impetus behind his argumentation, was an implicit argument against the caste system. So Buddhists argue for equality. They argue, well, equality is the main one, but among other things, they were sort of implicitly anti-caste. But it wasn't exactly anti-Hindu. Shiva and a lot of ideas developed by Shiva worshippers in India actually were borrowed by Buddhism. And I think Shiva himself is a part of the Buddhist pantheon of gods. That's sort of part of the more mystical side of Buddhism. But yeah, anyway, I'm getting off track. The point of this is that Buddhism was a counterpoint to Hinduism, and it actually almost successfully destroyed it. After Buddhism, was sort of innovated and started to spread, it spread very far in India, and it became the dominant religion in broad swaths of India, as well as Southeast Asia, where it's still pretty dominant today. It actually also spread to Indonesia, which I guess is also Southeast Asia, but it's not Buddhist anymore. It's the largest Muslim country in the world at this point. But there was a time when Indonesia was actually Buddhist, or at least had a lot of Buddhist institutions. Hinduism was also present there. You can still see it in Bali. I love tangents, I'm sorry. Buddhism basically spread far and wide throughout India. And Hinduism was kind of relegated to rural areas. It was basically just practiced at a local village level, and it was mostly in a sort of tribal form. Hinduism is worshipped in different ways, and the oldest form of Hinduism is sort of tribal Hinduism, where people at a tribal level, well, I should say tribal village level maybe, worship an individual god, and they have a little shrine, and they have customs and festivals and whatnot that they practice with relation to their worship. That's like the baseline form of Hinduism. That's kind of how it started thousands of years ago. Again, it has many different manifestations, but some of them are more sophisticated and urban than others. Some of the more text-based sects of Hinduism are generally more complex than just, worshiping a shrine or something. Some of them don't even care for idolatry in general. Some of them eschew all forms of idolatry and prefer to focus exclusively on the study and worship, let's say, of the holy texts, the Vedas, the Upanishads, and some of the others and whatnot. But anyway, though that higher type of Hinduism, the sort of high culture version of Hinduism, was severely set back in this period. Buddhism became the most common in like urban areas, and it became almost a state religion during the Mauryan Empire. And during this time period, Hinduism really had no choice but to change. And that's what it did. It actually borrowed a lot of ideas from Buddhism and other sort of different religious groups in India that were still doing well at that time. And it evolved into something that could actually compete. It became more egalitarian. Some of the logic and reasoning became more sophisticated and became more spiritual, whereas before it became more ritualistic. It had focused more on individual priests and customs and rituals. But after Buddhism almost crushed it, they had to evolve new customs, new rationalizations for the customs that they were already doing, and sort of a more spiritual outlook generally that could kind of meet Buddhism on its own terms. And as a result, Hinduism had a big comeback sort of around, like, I want to say 580, 680 or so, something around there, something around that era. And at that point, Hinduism became prominent again and was able to kind of suppress, well, maybe not suppress, but was able to get back its market share, so to speak, from Buddhism. And Hinduism looked a lot different as a result, from what it had been before. Islam also played a role in that, because Buddhism was a monastic religion and was very visible. You can tell people, you can tell a Buddhist monk out of a crowd, right? It's not hard. Mm-hmm. They have a very particular way of dressing, and they cut their hair Well, they cut off their hair rather. And Buddhist schools were very common and prominent. Buddhist temples and whatnot are generally very prominent in the communities that they operate in because they provide public services, they give people education. They do they used to do anyway, a lot of different things to provide public services in addition to providing religious services. So when Muslim invaders came in from Central Asia, they, of course, did not particularly appreciate non Islamic religions. And because Buddhism was one of the most visible, it in turn bore a disproportionate brunt of the oppression that Muslim invaders brought down on non Islamic faiths. Now, Hinduism, in contrast, or at least most of the sects of Hinduism, again, Hinduism also has monastic sects that are very visible. But a lot of it was not very visible, and so it was much harder for Muslim invaders to sort of stomp out those varieties. And so they continued to exist, especially in rural areas, like they had, when Buddhism had been prominent, but also in some cases even in urban areas. The earliest Muslim invaders were kind of shitheads. They were particularly violent. And to be fair to, Islam as a faith, they were generally not very representative of Muslims at the time. They were basically just Central Asian marauders of the same variety that had always marauded in Central Asia since time immemorial. But they just happened to have recently converted to Islam like a couple hundred years before. They hadn't really changed their marauding ways much, but, they technically worshipped a couple times a day and pretended to be Muslim. So there was that. So they invaded, they tore a lot of shit up. I think the Tughlaq dynasty was probably the worst of them in the Delhi Sultanate, which was like the Delhi Sultanate was the first big Muslim empire in India. And some pretty nasty abuses. There was a lot of torture. I think the Tughlaqs in particular were notorious for torture and targeting Hindu priests of one kind or another and whatnot. So they got a bad reputation as a result. Although there was some cosmic justice there. There was a guy named Tamerlane, and he was one of the great Central Asian warlords of history. He fancied himself sort of the second coming of Genghis Khan, and he wanted to try to replicate Genghis Khan's conquests. And he was pretty successful, and not only was he able to conquer huge tracts of territory, he was able to invade and conquer India, which Genghis Khan had actually not done. I don't entirely remember why. I think one of his sons tried, but it didn't work out because they had come into contact with one of the pre-existing Central Asian groups that had conquered India at that point. And because they were both basically Central Asian cavalrymen, India's government at the time had kind of an inside track. They had a little bit of an advantage that some of the other kingdoms Genghis Khan was kind of trying to attack at the time. Basically they knew Genghis Khan's tricks to a degree that some of the other countries and kingdoms he attacked were not. But that didn't work with Tamerlane, which I think he invaded like 100 years or so after Genghis Khan's invasions. I think Genghis Khan was like 1250 or so, and then Tamerlane would have been more like late 1300s. So Tamerlane swung into India. Technically, he was Muslim, but he was much more about the marauding than he was about converting. So he blew in with his army and he just wrecked northern India. Like he killed huge numbers of people while he was looting the place. I say he conquered it, but really more he just burned it and then left when he felt like he'd looted it enough. I don't think he bothered setting up like a dynasty like Genghis Khan and his children did in some of the other areas that they'd conquered. I think one of the most dramatic things I remember reading about Tamerlane's conquest of India was that when he invaded, I think it was Delhi, he ordered all of his men to collect at least one skull, or maybe it was three skulls. I don't quite remember that either. But basically, all of his soldiers had to bring had to meet a certain quota of skulls, which they collected from the civilians in the area, as well as some of the soldiers they fought. And he just built a giant mountain of skulls in the city, using all of these different skulls that people had brought to him. So it was pretty barbarous. It was not a great time to be in India, be it either Muslim or a Hindu for that matter. They didn't particularly discriminate against between the two at the time. But anyway, yeah, it was a rough period there when Islam was first invading northern India there. It settled down a bit with the Mughal Empire. Generally those leaders were more educated, like Babur. I think Babur was the first emperor of the Mughal Empire. He was the guy that actually founded it. And he was what was called a Persianized Turk. So most of the Central Asian peoples in the medieval period were ethnically Turkish, but they didn't really have much of a high culture of their own. Instead, the high culture in Central Asia was actually Persian culture. So Persian literature, Persian education, Persian art, all of those aspects of society in Central Asia, and especially urban Central Asia, were mostly Persian in nature. Persia was just considered like the most civilized state in the region, basically, at the time. So you may be a Central Asian Turkish marauder of one kind or another, but if you were the leader of a powerful tribe, or if you were the master of like a given city or whatnot, odds are you were educated in a Persian educational institution of some kind, or at least received Persian education generally. So the Persianized Turks were more sophisticated, basically, and so Babur was one of those. I think technically maybe some of the earlier invaders had been too, but you wouldn't know it by looking at their work. But Babur certainly had the better elements of Persianized Turk civilization. And so when he invaded, he actually preferred to use existing institutions as they were rather than building entirely new ones. He did build some new ones, but in general, he wasn't nearly as destructive or disruptive to Indian society as the Delhi Sultanate had been. So the Mughal Empire prospered as a result, much more so than I would argue the Delhi Sultanate had. And of course, one of his children was an emperor named Akbar the Great, and he's particularly fondly remembered because he was very cosmopolitan. He did not take a approach to governance that involved conversion as an obligation. As an Islamic leader, you were then, and to a degree are now, really obligated to try to convert people in your kingdom to Islam. And all of the rulers of the Mughal Empire tried to make that a priority to some degree, but Akbar did not make it as much of a priority as others. He saw equal value in different religions. He held a court with various different religious leaders and kind of made them argue with each other, sort of an early form of YouTube, I guess. And he tried to kind of learn the best aspects and ideas from all of them in order to try to benefit from them. So not every ruler in the Mughal Empire's history was as cosmopolitan and chill as Akbar was. Certainly not the last, certainly not Aurangzeb, who was particularly known for being an Islamic supremacist, maybe, to a degree. Some of that is a little unfair. Part of it he was just using Islam to get into power. That's a whole story unto itself. So he was kind of obligated to cater to Islamic leadership at the time, more so than previous leaders of the Mughal Empire. But regardless, he's remembered as being particularly conservative. But in general, the Mughal Empire overall was much more tolerant than the Delhi Sultanate, so it tends to be remembered more fondly as a result. Wait, how did we get into that?
A brief history of India. I asked you if it was possible to move out of your sect or your caste, sorry. And then we went into whether your caste was written down and why it was written down, and the British instituting that, which favored the conservative Hindus at the time unintentionally. And then we talked about mobility from caste and how you can change religions to sort of get out of your caste. But yeah, it was a cool tangent, and we got a brief story of India here.
Not sure how I got into. Oh, that's what it was. It's happened before. The caste system is flexible, and it's always been subject to disruptive social forces in India. Buddhism was one example that disrupted Hinduism significantly, and then the Islamic invasions also were very disruptive. In particular for Buddhism, since they were all but wiped out from northern India, but then also Hinduism. Although Hinduism was able to persevere partly because the Mughal Empire was relatively tolerant, but also because it was more of a rural religion and was able to kind of exist there outside the reach of Islamic administrations. Yeah, the urban areas in India, especially northern India, I should say principally northern India, historically, since the medieval period, have been more Muslim. And that's specifically because those were the centers of administration. And as a result, they tended to get a lot more immigrants from other parts of the Islamic world. They would get Islamic scholars, they would get Islamic tradesmen, and also bureaucrats from places like Persia and Central Asia would come and govern on behalf of this, that, or the other Muslim leader. So over time, that resulted in more Muslims, well, a greater proportion of northern India cities being disproportionately Muslim, and in a lot of cases, majority Muslim. But the rural areas were able to maintain sort of their Hindu nature because it was just harder for the government to extend its reach there. And it's also worth mentioning that even during the Delhi Sultanate, when the government was more prejudicially Islamic, that's not a word, was more prejudiced basically against Hindus. Even in that period and on up to the British period, successive governments in India in that period were dependent on Hindu intermediaries. So basically Hindu landowners, if not Hindu nobles. Those kind of comprised the middle tier and the lower tier of administration in India. And they didn't have enough Muslims, certainly not enough educated Muslims, to fill those roles. And as a result, successive Islamic governments could not be too aggressive against the Hindus lest they upset the Hindu nobility and cause some kind of uprising, which they could probably put down, but it would be very expensive and disruptive and better off not doing. The Tughlaq dynasty and the Delhi Sultanate had that problem. Although when Tamerlane invaded, it was kind of a different. Tamerlane was everybody's problem. But in general, yeah, especially in the Mughal Empire, they were more deferential to the Hindu nobility because they didn't want to piss them off because they needed them to be their administrators and to govern the land, so to speak. The British actually did that too, but it wasn't as big a deal for them because they didn't have any kind of social obligation to convert people, especially the East India Company, which was just more about the money. So they were quite happy to use Hindu scholars, Hindu nobles, Hindu landowners, and whatnot as part of their administration. It made a lot of sense for them. It didn't create too many waves, at least until like the later 19th century, when they started focusing more on actually trying to sort of anglicize the population. But yeah, those are all examples of disruptive forces that upset Hinduism. Just like with Buddhism, where the Hindu religion took ideas and evolved into kind of a new form, the same thing happened with Islam. They borrowed ideas here and there and tried to kind of build a new Hinduism that had the best aspects of Islam, at least the aspects that were popular. Other than equality, anyway. Obviously, that didn't make the cut, but other aspects, anyway, they adopted. So there was relatively more theism, for example, I think, in Hinduism after, the introduction of Islam. It had been kind of moving away from that, but it's kind of re-embraced it and reintegrated it. And there was a similar period of disruption and evolution as a result of British government. Although in that case, it wasn't so much Christianity. It was more liberalism, liberalism as an idea, and modernity interacted with Hinduism in a way that led it to embrace certain of those ideas and evolve correspondingly. Now, I should point out here, and this is important, even though Hinduism has evolved over time, it is, like I said earlier, very diverse. There are lots and lots of different sects within Hinduism. And the result of that is that even as the religion as a whole and most of those sects evolve over time, as they embrace new ideas that are introduced to India, you can always find sects that refuse to modernize, that refuse to evolve, and that embrace the old ways. And as a result, there are relatively more traditional conservative sects and relatively more liberal ones. And that is a very wide spectrum. Like, you can still find very rare sects in India that still practice Hinduism the way it was practiced 3,000 years ago, like way back when it was still very new. Those are the people who worship fire. Those are the people who pass down the Vedas and the stories in the Vedas purely orally. Like, they don't read the books. They teach their children the stories by word of mouth, and they actually require their children to memorize all of these stories. And these are long stories. It's no mean feat to memorize them, but they do. That's just a required part of growing up. And so that is the oldest school of Hinduism, basically, and you can still find it here and there. It's rare, but it still exists. And similarly, with each era of evolution, you can find sects that refuse to change and that still embody, even today, the state of Hinduism at the time of those social disruptions. So you can find sects that embrace Hinduism as it was like when Buddhism was dominant. There are still some that exist that practice Hinduism as it was when the Muslims invaded, and you've still got some that practiced Hinduism as it was when the British changed things. So, all of these different types of Hinduism exist side by side. And technically, there is mutual respect between them, because one of the basic precepts of Hinduism is that there are many paths to God. There is not one single interpretation of spiritualism and theism and whatnot that is the one explanation for how the world works and how to be a good person and how to practice faith. All of them are equally valid. And so that's kind of in the DNA of all of these different sects. So in general, for the most part, they all respect each other. And you don't really see, as a result, the same kind of sectarian tension between different branches of Hinduism like you see in Christianity or Islam or what have you. So while the religion is evolving, it's also very multifaceted and diverse. So don't go into it thinking you're not going to find, retrograde, backwards sects that do things that you don't like. You're going to find those. Those still exist for sure. But, for every one of those, you can find like a brand new sect that started just like 20 years ago by some guru who embraces a lot of the aspects of, say, I'm assuming most of the people listening are probably Western in outlook, most likely. So you can find sects in India that embrace a lot of Western ideas and ideals even, and try to predicate their interpretation of Hinduism on those ideas. I think a lot of I think some of the temples that have been set up in the West kind of are more like that. What do they call them? Swayamsevak Baps, something like that? Or no, it's Swami Narayana Baps. That's one of the principal types of temple, one of the principal groups anyway, that has been building temples in North America and Europe and other parts of the world. So that is a relatively more westernized version of Hinduism that emerged out of the late 19th century, early 20th century. So that kind of Hinduism would probably be more familiar and accessible to people in the West who are maybe uncomfortable with some of the customs in Hinduism that they don't like caste and whatnot. Now, that's not to say that every modern sect that is new is necessarily also modern in outlook. You can definitely find gurus who bring something new to the table that is inherently conservative in outlook. Some of the newer Hindu supremacist political groups in India have been pushing visions of Hinduism like that, although I don't think they've been very successful yet. And every so often you get a guru who just wants to have sex. Those exist too. That's not really any different than sort of the cult leaders you get here in the United States historically that just kind of are very charismatic and build up a leadership and then just abuse the shit out of the people that follow them. Hinduism has that too.
And there isn't any like church hierarchy like there would be in the Catholic Church where there are authority figures per se for Hinduism?
No, not Hinduism as a whole. You can find individual sects that might have a hierarchy. Generally, the more organized monastic sects will have something like that. Some of the temples will have that, for example. But there's also just as many sects that have very little or even no organization. You can start up a sect just by being a guru, just by being like a philosophical guy who spreads his message, and then people will follow you and you'll teach them. And you'll encourage them to go and teach people, and then they'll go and teach people. But otherwise, your followers are not obligated, say, to recognize any hierarchy between you and your followers and the people teaching your version of Hinduism. It could just be that you're really in it for the spirituality, and you just want people to enjoy your ideas. So in that case, there's zero organization virtually. It's just about the ideas spreading of their own accord through the population, rather. So that's kind of almost like maybe more equivalent to like evangelical Christianity almost, in so much as it's like very localized and has no overarching organization, unless it's like some kind of association or something anyway. But then you also get sort of intermediate groups, like there are temples that will teach people a given philosophy or faith or version of Hinduism. But then those people are not obligated then to themselves recognize any authority in the temple, right? You go there, you learn, you graduate, and then you're free to go and teach how you want, teach other people, maybe even teach your own version of what you were taught at the temple. Temples like that are almost basically just universities. They're responsible for teaching a given vision of Hinduism, but they're not obligated to control anything. They don't control themselves, other religious temples or institutions or whatnot, and they don't proselytize. They just take people who come to them, teach them, and then let them go. So it's just very diverse. Like you can find pretty much any of the above and probably everything in between in terms of organization within Hinduism somewhere. India is a fun subject.
Yes.
It's just very hard to learn.
There's a lot to learn because they're one of the oldest civilizations as well. I think
Yeah.
India is the oldest continuous civilization.
I believe so.
Maybe with China
Indus
being
River Valley. Yeah.
not too far off.
Yeah, it's pretty close, but I think India beats them. Because the thing about India is that people still live on top of the areas they originally settled like thousands of years ago, so we don't have all of the evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with China, you can kind of date it more. Because they were originally in the Los Plateau and then the Wei River Basin.
Mm-hmm.
That was sort of where Chinese civilization originated. But it's not really, it didn't become the main location, the main geography of Chinese civilization because they left that area and then settled in more fertile areas of China. But in India, pretty much all the places people live now are also places people lived like, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. It's all been pretty fertile. The only thing that's really changed has been the course of rivers and weather patterns. Supposedly that's what ended the Indus River Valley civilization. There was a lot of the rivers on which they built their cities changed course, and so they had to relocate the cities and move. And also there was a long period of, I think, drought where basically the monsoons were very weak. And so that also kind of screwed them over. So the result is that the civilization declined dramatically and evolved into other cultures and mixed with other cultures that migrated later. But yeah, it is definitely ancient. It seems like they're always finding new evidence that it's older than they thought and that they were more advanced than they thought. I think they were developing advanced urban sewer systems before even the Mesopotamians were, which was surprising because I think archaeologists and historians had thought that the Mesopotamians had been the principal pioneers a lot of the first civil engineering projects, but it seems as though the Indus River civilization may have actually beaten them on some of that. Yeah, it's very impressive. They were very smart. They knew what they were doing.
Yeah, features of water have been one of the main things that are a nice springboard for civilization. The Nile River Delta, and then India's got a lot of river deltas.
Yeah. Yeah, the Indus was the initial focal point, but then the Ganga, and then the other holy rivers, the Krishna River, the Kaveri River, the Narmada River, I think also. So yeah, just lots to work with, agriculturally speaking there. So lots of room to grow. Actually, there was so much in ancient India that there was probably multiple poles of civilization. It's a little hard to prove, but the theory I read in a book I got online anyway was that there was the Indus River Valley civilization that developed up in the Indus River area in the northwest. But what I read, there's a theory that there was another civilization that developed in the eastern Gangetic area, in the eastern Gangetic plain. So sort of west of Bengal and eastern, what is today Uttar Pradesh. And they called that Magadh. I'm probably mispronouncing it, but supposedly there was a civilization there called Magadh, that they called Magadh anyway. And the theory is that that civilization actually pioneered a lot of the core ideas that would form the foundation of Hinduism. Obviously, Aryan invaders from Central Asia brought a lot too that would be core to Hinduism. But as far as things like rituals and the worship of fire and the names of gods, the Aryans contributed more in that sense. But as far as like the philosophical ideas undergirding Hinduism, the spirituality, the sense of unity, the unity of all things in the universe, a lot of the sort of more broad-minded, deeper aspects of Hindu philosophy may have actually originated, according to this theory, in the Magadha civilization in this region. So that was another, it may have been anyway, another civilization. And then, of course, as anybody from southern India will tell you, the Tamils have their own civilization in the far south of India that developed independently. And it was influenced only much later by Sanskrit, basically Sanskrit culture, or in other words, Hindu culture that came south from the northern part of the country. So pretty much all of South Asia ended up getting Sanskritized, meaning it all ended up getting sort of assimilated into Hindu culture, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that there were not originally separate civilizations that had different philosophies, gods, and whatnot. And it could be that part of the reason that Hinduism and Indian culture in general is so cosmopolitan in outlook is because they had so many different major civilizations that were so sophisticated, all develop in close proximity, that being cosmopolitan in outlook was just inherent. It may have just been an organic outgrowth of all of the interaction that probably occurred between them. And it may also have been necessitated by the necessity of living together in complex, diverse communities. So many different cultures living so close together may have necessitated the development, the organic development and evolution of cultural norms that embraced cosmopolitanism and tolerance. Although I've also read that that may have been the impetus for the caste system. You could argue that the caste system may have been originally anyway, a benevolent approach to engineering customs and norms so as to prevent conflict between different groups of different backgrounds. We think of people of different castes in India of all being the same ethnicity. They're all Indian, although India actually has a multitude of different ethnicities, but that's another thing. But basically, people kind of assume implicitly that people of different castes are all of similar ethnic background, roughly similar Indian background. But thousands of years ago, that may not have been true. It may have been that lots of different peoples from different cultures, including Central Asia, the Eastern Gangetic Plain, Southern India, they all kind of merged together over time. But it may be that originally they were separate groups, and that part of how they maintained peace between these separate groups was by creating the castes to serve as a focal point for interaction. In other words, they created a bunch of norms and rules governing interaction between castes to prevent conflict. And you can kind of see that in what the rules are like, right? You're not supposed to marry between groups. You're not supposed to interact between them too much. And everybody has a role, right? This caste does this thing, this other caste does this other thing. In practice, it's not that rigid, but in general, that's how it works. So, having specific roles and governing the interaction between groups is a way of mitigating conflict. So it could be that originally caste as a system was meant to mitigate conflict and was a cultural norm that served that purpose. So tolerance and cosmopolitanism, yes, but it could be that caste, as prejudiced and discriminatory as it is, was not originally intended to be so. It may have originally just intended to recognize that different groups wanted to maintain the integrity of their groups, and so wanted rules to try to prevent them from getting upset, or well, to prevent that from happening. The rules are meant to maintain the integrity of the group over time. And as groups merged together and created a single civilization, the differences between those groups and castes kind of got lost to time, but the sort of logic behind it stayed. The logic of caste stayed, and it remains a core part of the culture to the point where the underlying mindset that caste inculcates kind of sticks with people, even as they move into other cultures or environments. But yeah, lots of different civilizations kind of cropped up in South Asia originally, at least 2, maybe 3 if you want to account Magadha, depending on who you talk to. And then, of course, there were all the other peoples that invaded The other ethnic groups that invaded from Central Asia, they brought a lot of new culture and integrated. And then there was some other groups too. Europeans to a degree, but a lot of the European descended people actually left in 1947, or was it 48? Whenever India got its independence, a lot of people of European descent actually left. Before that, there'd actually been a pretty good number. A lot of British people in particular had moved to India to engage in trade or to serve in the bureaucracy. Actually, it would have been more early 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s. Lots of British people were traveling to India to trade, to make money. And in that period of time, in the 1700s and early 1800s, British people who traveled there, specifically British merchants, were way, way less discriminatory. Well, let's say they were significantly less discriminatory than British people were later. Like the British people who came later were educated bureaucrats who were coming from high society in Britain, and they did not come to stay. They were just coming temporarily to serve as bureaucrats for some period of time, and then when they were done, they would go back to Britain. The merchants earlier, who predated those people, didn't really care. They didn't care about having like an Indian wife. They were happy to live in and among Indian people. In some cases, they went native and practiced Indian customs themselves and dressed in Indian clothing. It was not uncommon for British merchants to go native in India. Like Indian culture has that effect on people. It's a very attractive culture that has a way of assimilating people and drawing them in. So British merchants were no exception to that. And as a result, they were just much less discriminatory. But the takeaway here is that because they were more willing to mix with the population, there was a lot more mixed children that resulted from this specific period. So there was a lot of what were called Anglo-Indians that resulted, who were of mixed heritage. And it was the Anglo-Indians that that were disproportionately present in the British bureaucracy. Even later, when the British government started ruling India directly, a lot of the administrators in the bureaucracy, at least at the lower levels, were disproportionately Anglo-Indian in origin. So there was a pretty good number of Anglo-Indians by the early 20th century. And even though British people kind of still discriminated against them, they still saw them as Indian, they still at least recognized the fact that they had some British blood in them, and so they got relatively more privileges than other peoples in India. And so the Anglo-Indians themselves kind of saw themselves as a cut above the rest of the population. They kind of had well, not all of them, I don't want to speak too generally, but in general, the Anglo-Indian community saw itself as being of higher prestige than a lot of the other groups in India. And because they generally had a greater affinity for Britain than they did for the sort of Hindu nationalism that was emergent in India in the early 20th century, they were very paranoid and suspicious about what their fate would be in an independent India. They assumed that Indian nationalists would mistreat them, if not immediately, then eventually at some point. So when India became an independent country, most, I think, of the Anglo-Indian population actually left and relocated to either the UK or other places within the British Empire, that is to say. So as a result, India doesn't have nearly as many Anglo-Indians as it used to. I'm not even sure how I got onto that. There's so much to Indian history that you just can't help but go on tangents. Like, there's just so many things that you
It's
can
fine.
talk about.
Like, whenever you go deeper in one particular topic, then we just have a more thorough discussion about it, which is cool. And we've talked about India in the past. We watched a video series, can't remember I think it was BBC, Story of India or something like that.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, watched that a while ago. And it's so big a place that's been around for so long with so many different kinds of people and different kinds of beliefs and stuff that you're not really going to run out of things to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good subject.
Yeah.
Oh, actually, I can bring this full circle because you asked me how many castes there are.
Yes.
That's what started this. So historically, there's four, and maybe kind of sort of a fifth one if you want to count the untouchables. But historically, officially in the Vedas, in the literature, there's four: the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Shudras. Now, that's how it was like 2,500 years ago. Like when the caste was first introduced, that was kind of the system they went with, but that very rapidly degraded. So the more relevant caste is called jati. And your jati basically is like, your identity, it's your community. It has a big impact on, what you do in life, or at least what you're supposed to do anyway. So jati is the more relevant category of caste, much more so than Varna, which is more abstract. And it's actually the jatis that the Indian government and the British government before them uh, categorized and recorded. Like those are the ones that people are listed under, and not like the Varnas or anything like that. So if you want to know how many jatis there are, it's something on the order of 3,000, something in that range. It's several thousand at least. Because really, every region of India has its own jatis, and then individual communities sometimes have their own jatis, and it's endless. Like there's endless subdivisions. Like even within individual jatis, there are subcategories within that category that people can be broken into. And then sometimes those categories have subcategories. So
So
you
the
can see how
Varnas are basically the big picture types, and then your actual caste is more of like a local group to where you are of that type.
yeah, yes. Although I would remind again that the Varnas originally were specific types of caste, but they just degraded and then became meaningless. And when I say that jatis are more local, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're only local. It's actually possible for them to be regional. Like specific regions of India will generally have a particular set of agricultural castes that are predominantly farmers that'll be much, much more numerous than any other. So, like, I think the Reddys in Andhra Pradesh are an example. Or I've been reading about Karnataka, so the Valalikas, and then there was another one that was a super common, like the most populous caste there. So those castes are common throughout the state, and generally they're farmers and villages and whatnot. Villages generally have, a diversity of castes, but, every village pretty much has farmers, right? So it's easy for one particular caste to become the most dominant demographically. And generally, in a modern context, it's those large caste groups that are common in large regions that tend to be very politically powerful because they'll vote for people who are within their caste group. And so they have disproportionate political power as a result. But yeah, it's not purely local. Like you can have a given caste transcend locality and be more regional in scope.
Would they have caste membership kind of a thing? Where you're
Kind of.
registered, sort of?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's not done like it's done by the government, because, for policy reasons, basically. But as far as at a local level, at like a cultural level, by individual people and communities, they don't write that down really. I mean, they don't really have to because part of the naming conventions in India actually includes caste. Generally, your name actually includes your actual caste in it. So it's pretty easy to remember what caste you're in if only for that reason. But I should also point out that even within those large castes that are very populous, they generally have subcategories themselves that people can be broken into. So they all know that they're part of the super caste, right? The super group. But at the same time, they also have a separate identity as the subcaste within that group. So they'll vote according to the super group, but then as far as individual customs, as far as marriage, as far as things like that, they'll observe the specific tenets of their subgroup. Yeah, it's not hard at all to maintain these customs because there are so many rules in India as far as caste and community that are specifically designed to maintain the integrity of the community over time. Like endogamy, you're only supposed to marry people within the group who maintain a specific distance from you relationally. Like they know they have to allow people to marry like somewhat outside the group just to keep genetic diversity, but they did restrict it, like within certain supergroups, like broadly speaking. And the result of that is that it was much easier It maintains the customs of the individual group because it's only people who practice the same customs that can kind of marry into your group. And then, of course, there's the taboo about marrying down. That also serves to preserve things. But yeah, jatis are very complex. There's thousands of them. They differ regionally. Some are much larger than others, but everywhere you can, subcategorize them almost indefinitely. There's just endless variety. Like if you want to learn all of them, it would take a lifetime, and maybe even then you wouldn't be able to do it.
Pretty interesting. We don't really have that in the US. It feels like we have the opposite, where anyone could potentially make it big, depending on if you're a good enough entrepreneur, you take the right risks and that kind of a thing. Obviously, you'll have your general prejudice based on religious persuasion or how wealthy the person is. But yeah, the concept of caste is interesting and unique. I would guess that there are other countries that have some similar form of social stratification. It feels like any species is going to have social stratification for the roles of the group. Like you've got the more domineering ones who are kind of the leaders of the group, who are usually really strong and more aggressive, and then you've got the ones who are more the followers. And this whole system is a way of like coding that into specific sets of things, which it's going to have some issues in the sense that there are people who might not belong where they end up. But then overall, you do have those different kinds of roles that need to be filled by someone. And this is just kind of like handing you a card whenever you're born that says this is your role.
Yep. Yeah, I would elaborate on that though. Caste is not always and forever associated with job. In general, historically, they have been, but because economic dynamism kind of shakes up the status quo periodically, and because people try to find, opportunities to kind of make more money here and there, a lot of castes will kind of become detached from their original job that they were associated with. Like I was reading about the Nair caste in Kerala. They were originally warriors.
Mm-hmm.
But when the British took over India, there weren't really any more wars. So what do? So a lot of them apparently went into metallurgy and became ironsmiths of one sort or another. So that's an example of a major social change, causing a shift in caste orientation as far as job. Urbanization has had a big impact because obviously, if you're moving to a city and getting a job there, you're probably doing something radically different than what you were doing in a village in some rural area. But then even within the historical context of like conservative rural villages in India, like there would still be changes even there. People would find new things to do, develop new skills, and so then their caste might be uplifted and they would get like a new caste, or the caste would change its ranking, so to speak, vis-a-vis other castes. Or maybe they would even just break from their caste and found a new one. It was a very dynamic system and kind of is a dynamic system. So it's not inevitable that if you're born into a caste that you're going to be stuck with the job it's associated with. That can change with time and with context.
Chat is asking about the resurgence of modern Hindu nationalism.
Yeah, that's actually not that new. If you'd asked me a couple weeks ago, I would have said it was new, but I've been reading that book I told you about, and apparently that's got really deep roots in modern India. Like that started way back in like the 19th century. I said before, like Hinduism has a lot of diversity. You can find liberal reformers, but then you can also find the staunch conservatives. So the staunch conservatives during the period when Britain was introducing Western ideas to India and Indian intellectuals were embracing those ideas and being educated in Western ways, some of those people really went in the other direction. They looked at liberalism and said, that's nice. We'll take the technology, but otherwise we're going to stick with what we have.
We'll keep our customs.
Yeah. Specifically the most conservative manifestations of Hindu customs. So one of the first big organizations that was formed to that effect was the Hindu Mahasabha, which was originally founded just to celebrate Hindu festivals and to promote Hinduism, but eventually became the nucleus for later Hindutva, that is to say, Hindu supremacist institutions. I think it was founded in like 1902 or something like that, very early 1900s. And then later on, there was I think it was in the 1920s that the RSS was founded. That was the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is like People's Volunteer Group, roughly translated. And that was actually a Hindutva paramilitary organization. They didn't really commit acts of violence, or at least not very many. And when they did commit them, they didn't target the British. They were actually a lot more interested in the Muslims living in India. Being Hindu supremacist means that they were principally concerned about rival religious groups, in particular, the big proselytizing one in India, then as it is now, Islam. So they had a particular beef as a result with the Muslim League, which was the main party that emerged to represent Muslims in the nascent democratic institutions that the British set up in India in the decades leading up to independence. So the Muslim League wasn't very powerful for a long time, but when they started to gain traction, there ended up being a lot of tension with Hindu nationalists who wanted British India as a whole to not be cut up into different countries. They wanted the whole thing to be made into a new country. And Muslims were uncomfortable with that. They didn't like the idea of a country in which they were a minority. They didn't like the idea of being in a country in which they were a minority. And, the Hindu supremacists did not really do much to kind of assuage their concerns by way of being, supremacist, which inherently means that you disregard the rights of minorities. So when the Muslim League started getting more support and more power, that resulted in a number of riots and violent incidents, principally between the Muslim League and some of the more violent members of the Muslim League, and then the Hindu supremacists of one sort or another. And the RSS played a leading role in that early period there, 1920s, 1930s, and into the 1940s. And I'm sure there's other groups. My knowledge of early 20th century Indian history is pretty nascent. Like a lot of what I've learned just like in the past couple of weeks reading that book. So it's all pretty new, but it all kind of illustrates that Hindu supremacy, Hindutva ideology, so to speak, has roots, pretty much from the start of India's period of modernization. That's been a factor. They've been one of the leading political forces. They were never the leading political force. In general, the Indian National Congress was the leading independence Indian nationalist institution, and their leadership kind of varied. They had right-wing and left-wing factions in the Congress, but overall they were relatively westernized, Western educated, and had relatively more Western values, much more so than the Hindutva did. Although there were some Hindu supremacists in there as well, but they generally weren't as rabid as the guys in the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha. So because the Congress leadership was more educated and well-off and westernized, they did not institute Hindutva policies upon independence. They were generally interested more in building something resembling a secular nationalist socialist state. I think I mentioned last time that India, I don't know when I mentioned it, but India's first independence government was kind of more left-leaning and had more of a socialist outlook on economic policy. So in turn, they tended to have more of a socialist outlook generally on governance and society. And as a result, they didn't particularly get along with the Hindutva, at least not the ones that were in the party anyway. But yeah, that changed with time. Congress eventually lost support. It kind of fractured. Some of that was their own fault, bad economic policies, authoritarianism, in the case of Indira Gandhi. But, the end result is that other parties emerged. And I've kind of noticed in my reading thus far that a lot of the leaders of the different parties that emerged in the sort of early decline of the Congress Party were themselves former Congress members. It's worth pointing out that Congress easily had, and maybe still has, the deepest organizational depth of any party in India. And as a result, for a long time, they generated most of the leaders that would go on to oppose them. This, that, or the other leader that had kind of grown up in Congress's lower levels would turn on them and kind of found their own party and would take a lot of their supporters with them. So that was the origin story for a lot of opposition parties in India in the 1960s and 70s. So these guys would turn on them, and for a while they were successful. The Janata Party was the principal opposition party in the 70s, and they were able to actually win the first election after emergency rule was ended, as declared by Indira Gandhi, and get her out of power, which ended India's sort of brief flirtation with authoritarianism. That was a big win for Indian democracy, but it didn't really result in a big win for the Janata Party per se, because they had created an opposition coalition party, basically, that consisted of a wide range of different groups, all of which had very little in common. And the result is that once they were in power, the coalition almost immediately started fracturing. And eventually they lost power in the early 1980s in an election in which Congress actually came back. And not only was it the Congress that came back, it was actually Indira Gandhi herself. So she was not nearly as authoritarian in her second bout in power as she was in the first. But it was an unfortunate defeat there for the opposition forces, although probably an inevitable one given all the differences between them. But yeah, Congress was relatively left-leaning at that time, and a lot of the breakaway splinter groups that formed in turn were also kind of more left-leaning generally. There was some variance there, but in general they were more left-leaning. Things really kind of started to change more in the 1980s, from other reading I've done anyway. One of the things that happened was TV got to be really common. And it kind of, India had TV, from the start. But because India was so poor, it wasn't necessarily that common until the 1980s when it got much cheaper and more people were able to buy them. And the reason TVs were relevant is because they started doing religious programming. And, well, maybe I shouldn't say religious programming per se, but they started making TV shows that told the stories of Hindu gods. Hinduism and Hindu stories and Hindu literature focuses a lot on the stories and background of Hindu gods, especially, the big names like Shiva, Vishnu, Krishna, the most popular gods, basically. Their stories, their histories are very, very well known throughout India, even amongst people who are not that religious. And so, if you're a TV producer and you want to make a TV program that gets good ratings, that's a good choice, right? You could tell the story of Shiva, make a program about that. And that's what they did. And it got huge ratings. Lots of people liked it. But it had the inadvertent side effect of kind of creating a minor religious revival. It kind of brought people back to their religious roots and created a new market and demand for a more conservative strand of Hinduism. You can kind of see the pattern here. Modern institutions, modern ideas inadvertently recharging and revitalizing traditional forms of Hinduism. The British did that with their ontology and administration, and now you can kind of see it happening again with television and the introduction thereof. To kind of get ahead of myself a little bit, you can say that the internet also had the similar effect, because the most radical people basically all are able to form a little bubble and then represent Hinduism in a particular way, their conservative nationalist way, in other words. And that in turn has a knock-on effect of revitalizing or maybe even creating an entirely new nationalist, chauvinist brand of Hinduism that was even more radical than the Hindutva that came before them. But again, that's getting ahead of myself. In the 1980s, television helped revive conservative Hinduism, or at least a variant of Hinduism that was more focused on the gods and their stories rather than necessarily the ideas and the literature. So that had an impact of creating relatively more demand for religious parties, or at least more demand for policies advocated by parties that wanted to reintroduce more religion into politics. From the start of India, even before independence, when the British were negotiating with Indian nationalists about what kind of India they wanted, it was clear that there was a debate about creating a secular India and a Hindu India. And the secular side won, but the Hindu side never went away. There's always been people who advocated for a more explicitly Hindu India. And up until the 80s, the secular side kind of had the weight of power and leadership on their side, but that really started to change in the 80s. So you can consider that, I guess, another change. That wasn't necessarily due to TV. TV helped create more demand for that. But politicians themselves started shifting more in that direction, kind of on their own, partly as an extension of pre-existing Hindu nationalist ideas. Also because Congress was in decline because of corruption scandals. The Janata Party was in decline because of fracturing and splintering. So the religious right was, well, maybe not religious right, but the religious nationalist right parties were the only ones who were kind of left as far as opposition. That was an obvious choice to go to if you were looking to defect to another party. And they were able to make the most of that and win more power. At that time, the principal religious party was the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP. But they were relatively small then. Whenever they won power, they invariably had to get it through negotiating a coalition agreement with another party. Like invariably, they did not get enough seats in any given state, or certainly not at the national level, for them to form a government without some kind of help. But the fact that an independent right-wing nationalist religious party like the BJP was able to get enough votes to be a major player at all really shows you the trend starting in the 80s towards a more nationalistic religious Hindutva politics. Originally, they had been a different party called the Bharatiya Jana Sangh, and that had been the principal right-wing religious party in India in the post-independence period, 1950s, 60s, 70s. But they ended up merging with other parties to form the Janata Party in order to oppose Congress. Again, it was a big tent party. It was basically the I hate Indira Gandhi party, and that was the only thing they had in common, rather. And when they achieved the goal, they broke apart. And one of the factions that the Janata Party broke into was the Bharatiya Janata Party. And that's sort of their origin story there. They basically took the most religious elements in the Janata Party that were left over from the Bharatiya Jana Sangh and formed a new party out of them. Now, that's not to say that there were not other parties that had more of a religious leaning or more of a Hindu outlook, but generally those were more individual parties. They didn't necessarily have an overarching ideology. If you want to define Indian politics, caste and personality are the main things. Like a popular party that has a popular policy platform may actually collapse completely if its leader dies. That's happened several times since India's independence. You may think that a party is doing all the right things, is governing well, and that they're going to continue getting voting support no matter what happens. But then mysteriously, when the party leader dies, suddenly voters just defect and start voting for other parties. And that's because personality is a big part. People in India, well, I shouldn't say all of them. You can't generalize. You really want to when you talk about India because it's so big, but you can't. But in general, voters in India will try to judge their leaders according to how pious they are, how prestigious they are, and how effective they are in bringing goods to their patronage network. It's sort of, is this guy a good man, and is he going to bring money to the table if we vote for him, for our group specifically, generally their caste. So as a result, the relationship voters have with parties is not really so much a relationship between voters and policy outcomes, so much as it is a relationship between voters and people, specifically the people who lead the party. And invariably, the people who lead parties in India almost invariably hoard power within their party to make it their party. Like it's almost run as a family dynasty in some cases, where the sons will inherit the party. So because politics is personalized like that, it's kind of hard to point to party successes as being representative of being representative of voter affinity for given policies. So the success of, say, Congress in the mid-20th century was not necessarily indicative of a lack of religious faith amongst the popularity and an inherent preference for secular socialist policies. It was more about the fact that the leaders of Congress had been the ones who led the country to independence. They went out of their way to show themselves and present themselves to the public as being pious, good people, and also patriots, nationalists who wanted the country to succeed. So that created a personal relationship with people, and in large part, that's what people were voting for when they voted for Congress. But eventually, Congress lost that connection. Jawaharlal Nehru was the first leader of India after independence. Eventually, he died. Indira was hugely controversial. She tried to continue the patronage network, but it broke down. And so people started looking for other personalities to attach to. And so those personalities invariably were different ideologies. But that just underlines my point that voter support for this, that, or the other party doesn't necessarily indicate support for particular policy outlooks. It's more about the personal relationship. So to bring things ahead, voter preference for the BJP now, which is the main party controlling India right now, that does not inherently reflect an innate preference for Hindutva policies per se, although definitely Hindutva vote for them. Not every BJP voter is Hindutva, but almost every Hindutva voter is a BJP voter. We can kind of put it like that. So it's not support and electoral success for the BJP does not necessarily indicate underlying support for Hindutva policies. Rather, it indicates a lot of faith and investment of the people of India, a great many people in India, in the personality of Narendra Modi, whom is the principal personality in charge of the BJP. Now, somewhat perhaps ironically, the BJP actually did try to be the ideological party of the right, specifically the religious right in India, for a long time. But even they couldn't get out of this personality-based politics. Like invariably, when they won, they won because they had a charismatic leader who was carrying them forward. And perhaps, no better example of that is Narendra Modi himself. Like the BJP was never more successful than when Narendra Modi became the leader and face of the party. He is their guy, for sure. To the point where it's actually created some tension with the older leadership in the party. The guys who had originally founded the party kind of wanted to run it as more of a big tent. Well, maybe not a big tent, but they wanted to run it in a way that was not based just on personality. They wanted to kind of vet people based off of their commitment to the cause, so to speak. But Narendra Modi came in, and it's basically just the Modi show now. It's the Modi party. If you like Modi, you vote for the BJP, even if you don't care about Hindutva stuff. And some of the original founders would prefer the party focus more on Hindutva policymaking, but Modi doesn't care, and because the only reason they're winning is because of Modi, they can't do anything about it. And some of them have even left the party over that, because they're just so butthurt about it. So yes, there are ideological debates in India, socialism versus capitalism, Hindutva versus secular. These are real policy debates in India. I don't want to downplay that. But in terms of the voter behavior of the broader part of the population, those bigger philosophical abstract debates are not really all that important in the grand scheme of things. Most voters are more interested in personality and patronage, specifically patronage vis-a-vis their caste. And that's kind of what it comes down to. It's a sort of realpolitik at a local level, you might say. That's one way of describing it. Much to the chagrin of the intellectual elites in India, which generally are still more Western in outlook and prefer more of a policy-based politics rather than a personality-based politics, not least because personality-based politics invariably leads to misbehavior and corruption, since people will keep voting for you even after you get in trouble, so long as you keep the money flowing. That's not great for the health of any democratic system, but there's not much they can really do about it. I think the big party now that you vote for if you really want good governance, policy-based governance, is the AAP. They've been making some gains. I think they actually just won control of Punjab province. That was a big win for them. Before that, they'd only been able to win control of New Delhi, specifically the municipality. But Punjab is going to be the first state-level test of whether that kind of party can actually really govern well. It may be that they can't. It may be that, given how much corruption there is in Indian politics, that you just have to engage in the same kinds of corrupt politics in order to get anything done. So they may be hobbled in their effort to be a sort of liberal, modern-minded party.
We're going to fight corruption with corruption.
They may have to. They may have little choice in the matter. We'll see. But this actually, the success of the AAP doesn't undermine my argument either, that it's still principally personality-based and caste-based. Because like I said, sort of the modern secular people of India are kind of a caste unto themselves almost. And I would also add that the history of the AAP is the history of the party being taken over by Kejriwal. I'm almost certainly mispronouncing his name, so I apologize. That's my best effort. But the party was founded by a guy named Kejriwal. It was originally founded in conjunction with other people who, had an equal footing in the party. But eventually there were, as there invariably are, disagreements within parties about what direction they should go, electoral strategy, what have you, policy platform, that kind of thing. And, ideally, they would have been able to work those differences out and reach a consensus. But instead, what happened is that Kejriwal basically just kicked everybody out of the party who disagreed with him. So that's another example of a political party in India becoming based on personality more than on policy. So you could say that in his case, Kejriwal's personality-based politics are predicated on him pushing policy-based politics. It's a little weird, but effectively that's how it works. And given that the party basically has not really evolved beyond Kejriwal, it's questionable whether or not it would necessarily be able to survive beyond him. Ideally, it would. Ideally, it could actually evolve into the kinds of idea-based party that they want it to be. But right now, it's still a personality-based party, very similar to the other kinds of parties like that in India, at least for the moment. It just happens to be a relatively more Western liberal-minded one. We doing okay on time?
Yep. Could go for like another 10, 15 if you want.
That sounds good. What do I have here? I think I already talked about some of this.
People are asking for a clarification on the definition of realpolitik.
So realpolitik, I was kind of using it more metaphorically, but realpolitik was originally was a set of, well, I shouldn't say set, it was a style of politics that was used by, what was his name? German dude, Bismarck, there we go. Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of Imperial Germany in the late 19th century. And so his style of politics was very much defined by realism. Germany had certain core interests, well, specifically the creation of Germany. I guess I should say he was Chancellor of Prussia before he was Chancellor of Germany. But one of his core objectives was to unify the German-speaking states and create a German empire. And he didn't particularly care what he had to do that. He was not really bound by sort of restrictions of morality, ethics, what have you, like whatever steps he felt needed to be taken to ensure the creation of a unified Germany, he took them, up to and including de facto engineering a war. The Franco-Prussian War was in large part a war that he instigated. The French had some culpability. You can't just completely absolve them, but Otto von Bismarck very much wanted that war, and he went out of his way to engineer it in a somewhat duplicitous manner. So the use of hard power, the use of war, deception, etc., that's all in that. Those are all aspects of realpolitik. It's just the ultimate form of realism, at least in so much as it comes to foreign policy. So you can kind of take that attitude and approach and apply it to other aspects of life. You can prioritize being a good person, but sometimes you have to be a hard ass. Sometimes you have to be forceful to get what you need done, or maybe even just what you want done. So you could say that's kind of a metaphorical realpolitik used at a personal level.
It seems a little bit like ends justify the means kind of a style.
Yeah, that's part of the logic for sure. So in the case of India, the way I was using it, voters will, rather than focusing on lofty ideals of democracy and socialism and trying to do what's best for everybody and doing what's best to preserve liberal democracy, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them focus very narrowly on self-interest. How is this particular candidate going to benefit me and my group? And you can call that selfish, to a degree it is, but really it's just self-preservation, it's self-interest. Like everybody else is doing that. India is very poor, so people need money, and there's not a lot of other things that are really relevant to poor rural peasants in India. So that's how they vote. They focus on the meat. Are you going to bring money to my group? If the answer is yes, pretty likely you'll get a vote. If no, or if they suspect the answer is actually going to be no, if they actually win power, then they won't vote for them. This is a simplification, but in general, that's the approach. And so the analogy I make is that that's similar to realpolitik. People want a certain outcome. They want benefits from the state. They want their caste to have special privileges. And so they'll vote for people who deliver those things, even if it's at the cost of the overall health of the political system or the health of the overall economy. think we talked about China last time, right?
Yep. That was probably the main focus.
Yeah. Didn't get a whole lot of feedback on that. Although I guess we did get the one guy talking about the government controlling the weather.
I wonder if that's legit going to be a thing that we try to mess with more. I don't really know of cases where we actually do that yet.
I don't think we do it yet, but it is something that some people have advocated as a potential solution to climate change and some of the problems therein.
Mm-hmm.
I think they call it geoengineering. I think that's the appropriate name. There's been some people who advocate for that. I think there's some technologies in development that might be able to facilitate it. I think the most common idea I've heard as far as geoengineering and climate change was not blotting out the sun per se, but putting up like a big net that reduces the amount of sun that the Earth gets. So the idea being that you could kind of cool things off by doing so. So yeah, I'm sure we'll try to do it eventually. You know, the technology's there and the potential benefits are there, but I don't think it's really viable as of yet.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh. So much stuff in here.
He has all kinds of notes.
I do. They're not particularly well organized. At least not right now. Well, we could do a little more India stuff. I could kind of briefly run through some of the regions of India.
Sure. It's an India episode already anyway.
Yeah, I guess that's been the main thing we've talked about today, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, let's see. The Bengalis are probably the most proud. You know, Bengal obviously was separated as a result of partition. So the Muslim part became Bangladesh, and then the Hindu part became the state of West Bengal in India. But before independence, it was all just one province, and it was called Bengal. And the thing about Bengal is that that was sort of ground zero for the British Empire in India. I mean, obviously, they also kind of settled in and around Bombay on the west coast, and then also Madras in the south of India. But Calcutta and Bengal was easily like the most successful, prosperous part of British India. Yeah, that was the most successful outpost. And so, in turn, that became the center of British India's administration, the center of its commercial activity. It was just the center of British India, like the most important geographic region. And so one of the results of that is that Bengal ended up getting economically developed well in advance of the other parts of British India that the British controlled. So there was a lot more industry that developed, especially heavy industry that developed in Bengal, much more so than other regions, and also a lot more penetration of financial firms. So like a lot of British firms owned a lot of land there and did a lot of things that were very bad to the local plantation, to the local people who worked on their plantations. A lot of the most egregious examples of violence, either explicit violence or discrimination or policy dislocation or what have you. A lot of that happened to Bengali farmers on plantations owned by, British firms of one sort or another. But on the upside, one of the advantages they had is that they actually were educated in Western sciences and whatnot well in advance of other parts of India. So it ended up producing a disproportionate share of India's intellectuals in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. So a lot of the people who actually were the leading figures in the independence movement, the leadership of the Indian National Congress, and then also a lot of the leaders of the more violent manifestations of the independence movement, a lot of the rebel groups and whatnot that cropped up. A lot of those leaders, not all of them, but a disproportionate share were Bengali in origin. And that's because relatively more Bengalis were getting educated than in other parts of India. So because they were more educated then, much earlier than other parts of India, at least in terms of Western education, Bengali intellectuals ended up sort of becoming the early determinants of what would become Indian literature, Indian science, Indian politics, etc. Now, the result of that, as far as the image of Bengalis, especially the image they have of themselves, is that they think of themselves as the intellectuals of India. And they also are very proud of the role that they played, the disproportionate role anyway, in the independence movement. So there's a lot of Indian nationalism in Bengal, but there's also a lot of residual Bengali nationalism in Bengal. You know, they have a high opinion of themselves, sometimes to the chagrin of other people in India. Now, unfortunately, one of the tragedies of Bengal was partition, and that played a big role in the decline of Bengal economically. You know, again, it had been like the most prosperous state, or at least it had the largest economy. Maybe I should put it like that. It did not have the largest per capita output in India, even before independence, but in terms of overall output, it was one of, if not the largest in India. But after partition, it started to decline. Part of the reason for that is that a lot of the factories in Bengal were located in the western part of the state, the Hindu part of the state, in and around Calcutta, especially. But a lot of the inputs that went into those factories were jute, which was grown in the Muslim part of Bengal. So after partition, there was a war, obviously, between Pakistan between Pakistan and India. Bengal, the Muslim part of Bengal, was originally part of Pakistan. It didn't become Bangladesh until later. But that meant that tariffs were basically applied. They couldn't really trade. And so a lot of the factories lost business because they were not as cost competitive, because their primary input had become immediately more expensive, overnight. So that had a deleterious impact on some of the major textiles and industries in Calcutta, which were amongst the leading in India. And later on, there was a lot of communist activity, because like I said before, they were the most educated in Western education and Western ideologies, but Western ideologies not only included, liberalism and whatnot, it also included communism. And so as a result, Bengal politics produced way more communists than any other part of India. And a lot of the early leaders of the socialist and communist movement in India, or movements, I should say, a lot of them were disproportionately Bengali as well. So the result is that the Communist Party of India had a lot of power in Bengal. They had a very strong base of support there. And they obviously were very active in terms of strikes and demanding redistributive policies at either the national or the state level. And over time, they became sufficiently aggressive and militant that a lot of industries in Bengal decided to just leave. It was just more cost effective to relocate or shut down or what have you. And that didn't happen overnight, but that happened over the course of like 20 to 30 years. There was a lot of protests and strikes in the 50s and 60s, and then in the 70s, they actually were able to win power. I think they might have won power briefly earlier than that, but certainly in the 70s and 80s, they were able to win power and actually control the state. And they, of course, implemented a number of policies that were not very good for business, to the point where they actually still controlled the state in the 90s, but actually liberalized some of the regulations and whatnot that they'd implemented before, just because they recognized that the economy of the state had declined so much that they really needed to do something to try to generate growth and improve quality of life. And they did that through the 90s and the aughts, but eventually they became associated with economic decline and corruption. And the people of West Bengal voted them out, and they started voting for Trinamool Congress, which is basically a kind of sort of center-left nationalist party. I should say Bengal nationalism. Again, Bengali nationalism is a big thing there. So at this point, they're not really communists anymore, but a big part of the reason that Bengal stopped being the major economic center of India after independence, besides partition, which is the main thing, was also the rise of communism in Bengali politics. And they haven't really recovered from that, and they may never recover. It's inherently hard to develop modern manufacturing, modern services sector. And they have had some success in developing a tech sector, but that's low barrier to entry. You basically just need to develop human capital that can do that. And India has pretty decent education, so no surprise that that's worked. But as far as like modern manufacturing, or a restoration of the heavy industry that originally made West Bengal a powerhouse. That doesn't really seem likely. That doesn't seem to be in the cards. But anyway, the point of all that is just to illustrate why Bengal was so important and why Bengali pride and nationalism is a big part of their identity. And also why Bengalis are disproportionately represented in Indian literature, art, etc. They're just they were just early leaders of those areas because they had early exposure to Western education. So that's Bengal. And that's a unique, and also, it's worth mentioning too, Bengal is unique because it had always kind of been on the edge of Hindu civilization in India. It was always just very difficult to plant crops there because there's all the flooding. So they kind of needed, it wasn't until maybe like 1,000 years ago that it was really heavily settled, because it took until then to develop the sort of drainage technology and other farming practices that made the land viable. So it was kind of a frontier area as far as South Asian civilization. And by the time they had the technology to settle it, India was still being governed by Muslims. And so it was disproportionately settled by Muslims as a result. And the people there were largely converted to Islam too. Which is why Bengal today, as a whole anyway, is disproportionately Muslim. But that's another story. That's kind of getting into another thing. But the idea that Bengal would be disproportionately Western in outlook and would have a different culture somewhat than other parts of India, that's not without precedent. It's kind of always been like that. So that's Bengal. So then you go east. So, well, let's go west just to save time. West of Bengal is sort of the Hindu belt. That's like the heartland of India, and especially of Hinduism. Like the holy city of Varanasi is located there along the Ganges River. So it kind of differs depending on the part of the basin you're in. It's kind of one continuous thing that flows from west to east. The Ganges River is the main river, but there's a lot of tributaries. But in general, they all flow west to east. And the eastern part of that basin, which is sort of the modern states of Bihar, Jharkhand, and then eastern Uttar Pradesh, that area is the most conservative, generally. They've got the most conservative outlook on Hinduism, and they also tend to live, they live differently than their ancestors did, like hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, but the tempo of life is very much the same. The area is very much dominated by rural villages engaging in traditional farming, and they're generally very poor and very conservative. So that's very much old school India there in that region. And some of the worst abuses regarding caste violence often happen in that area. So you go further west into the western part of the Gangetic Basin, so western Uttar Pradesh, and then closer to Haryana, for example. Those areas are also very conservative, also very attached to Hinduism and traditional forms of Hinduism, but they're also historically relatively better off. They're not as poor as the eastern part as the eastern part of the region. And the reason for that is that historically that region has been the center of a myriad of governments through the history of India. And historically, they've focused a lot of civil engineering a lot of spending on civil engineering projects has been focused on that region because that's generally where the capital was. New Delhi, in particular, has been a prominent administrative center in North India for the past 1,000-some years. So successive administrations then focused on developing the area around it. And so irrigation was much more developed there, and trade was much more developed there. And also being the center of government meant that there was a disproportionately large chunk of the population located in the cities in that region. So the cities in that region were particularly converted, or at least had a disproportionately large populations of Muslims in them. That's changed since partition. Up until independence, you could still find a lot of Muslims in the urban areas in Uttar Pradesh, especially western Uttar Pradesh. But then when partition happened, there was a big population exchange. A lot of Muslims were not comfortable living in a Hindu majority India, so a lot of them left. And so western Uttar Pradesh lost a lot of its Muslims. And it was kind of sad. Well, it was sad. It was sad because a lot of those communities had lived there for a very long time and had deep cultural roots and played a big part in the local culture. New Delhi in particular was mostly Muslim, I think, before partition. and it had a long history as being, the capital of successive Islamic empires. It had a long, deep cultural history, producing things like Islamic poetry in the local language and religious schools and education. Like, lots of cultural institutions had been located there, but they kind of lost a lot of those because of partition, because so many of the Muslims that lived there relocated to Pakistan. Uh, in turn, though, to kind of, I don't want to end on a downbeat, a lot of people who lived in the Muslim majority parts of Punjab province ended up leaving, and a lot of them settled in this region, not just New Delhi, but also Western Uttar Pradesh and the cities thereof. So the result then is that while the region lost its traditional Islamic culture, it actually gained a lot of Punjabi culture, and that's interacted with the local culture and also has been a big influence on the urban culture in the area, if not in India generally. So that's been one of the interesting big cultural changes there for that region. But yeah, in general, it's still very conservative, but it's just like somewhat better well off, somewhat more well off because there was more investment in the agriculture there than in some other regions. And then Punjab itself is actually further west than that. So Punjab used to be a really wealthy province, and it hadn't always been, but the British invested a lot in the irrigation there, like late 19th century, early 20th century, so it got to be disproportionately wealthy. And it got even more wealthy during the Green Revolution in the mid 20th century, because Punjab was, I believe, one of, if not the first state in India to really benefit from the Green Revolution. A lot of the early pilot programs and whatnot were started there. And so Punjabi farmers disproportionately benefited as a result. So the farmers there are very well off, basically. Maybe not well off by Western standards, but by like Indian standards, they do pretty well for themselves. It had been one of the leading states economically in India. They had been in the process of industrializing, especially the capital at Lahore. I think that was the capital. At least it was the largest city. But then partition happened, and the state got cut in half. And the Muslim I should say Pakistan ended up getting Lahore. There was some debate about who would get Lahore because the population was very mixed between Hindus and Muslims, but it was also kind of really close to the dividing line between the Hindu majority and Muslim majority parts of the state. So there was some debate about that, and eventually it was decided it would go to Lahore. So the problem there is that a lot of the Hindu population of Lahore left because they didn't particularly like the idea of living in a Muslim majority country. Also because there was a lot of violence at the time. I haven't really mentioned it, but partition involved a lot of violence by far right militias of one sort or another. So that also acted as an impetus for people to relocate. But a lot of those people left, and the city's economy took a hit as a result. So Punjab, as an economic center, kind of ended with partition. It was still important, very much so, and it did recover, especially in the Pakistani part. And the Punjabi part, the Indian part of Punjab is still relatively wealthy, but it never really fully industrialized like it might have if not for partition. But anyway, it's well off, but the people in Punjab are known for being really gregarious. Like they're very outgoing, extroverted, they have big personalities. They're seen as being like the party goers, kind of India, of all the different cultures there. They also migrate a lot. Part of that is because they have the money to. It's kind of an expensive process, but because it's a relatively well-off state, disproportionately more Punjabis seek out migration. And also there's kind of a tradition of it. It's kind of a rite of passage almost in some places. And a lot of them end up in Canada, which is why Canada has a disproportionately large proportion of its Indian population as Punjabis.
Dude, the place that we lived in Vancouver.
Yeah.
We were in a basement suite, and the people who owned the place were Punjabi.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect example. And it's worth pointing out, too, that Punjab is the geographical origin. That is where Sikhism was developed. I'm American, so I'm technically supposed to call it Sikhism. So that religion is not the dominant religion of all Punjabis. Probably Muslims would be first, and then Hindus, and then Sikhs. But within the Punjab state, which is part of India now, Sikhs are probably pretty close to a majority there. In fact, Punjab was specifically created as it is now, specifically so that Sikh political power would be maximized. The original Punjab state after independence was actually larger than that, but there was a Sikh political party that emerged in Punjab that wanted a sort of Sikh majority state. And they advocated for that, and part of that process involved cutting out the Hindu majority parts of the state. So Haryana actually was originally part of that, was originally part of Punjab, but it was cut off into an independent state later on.
A little bit of gerrymandering.
A little bit, yeah. That's not uncommon in India. There was briefly a Sikh separatist movement, actually, in the 1980s. They were sort of militant Sikh nationalists who wanted an independent Punjab that could be like an independent Sikh country. They called it Khalistan, and it was called the Khalistani movement. And famously, there were some militants who seized that, I don't remember what the temple is called. It's the big temple at Amritsar. It's like the main temple of Sikhism. So some militants actually stormed it, and they refused to leave until the Indian government gave in to their demands. And Indira Gandhi, who was president at the time, actually had to make a difficult judgment call about whether to send in the military, and she actually did. So the military, the Indian army, stormed that temple, and it was a hugely controversial move. A lot of people in the Sikh community were really upset about that, including the ones who did not agree with the militants. And the fallout from that is that her 2 Sikh bodyguards actually killed her. That was actually how she got assassinated.
Whoa.
Yeah. And that resulted in a lot of communal violence, especially in northern India. There was a bunch of riots where people attacked people in the Sikh community, especially in New Delhi. And I think several thousand Sikhs were killed in that communal violence as a result. So that was a pretty rough period for Sikhs in India. A lot of people were upset at them kind of as a group for assassinating the prime minister, even though it was just like the 2 guys that did it.
Blue Star Temple?
Oh, is that what it was?
It's Chat's guess.
I would defer to Chat on that. I honestly don't remember. But let's see. South of Punjab is the Rajasthan, and that's a really cool state. That's almost like the Texas of India. It's I think it's the biggest state by geographic size, but they also have a long history of being independent that goes back like centuries. It's kind of more of a tribal culture. They're very insular, and it's not very populated because it's semi-arid. It's almost a desert in some places, but that's kind of served to make them very hardy. And so the clans that live there historically have been important warriors and have frequently fought against Muslim invaders or even on behalf of Muslim invaders. Generally, whoever you are running India, you want the Rajputs on your side because they can definitely cause trouble for you. But they have a pretty deep culture going back a long time as being sort of these independent frontiersmen type figures. And then Gujarat down there is fun because that's like historically a major commercial region. They're associated more with commercial activity. And that's a tradition that continues up till today because a lot of the Indian migrants that come to the United States are disproportionately from Gujarat. Like you may have heard that pretty much all of the motels in the United States are controlled now by people of Indian descent. A huge chunk of those people are actually Gujarati in origin. And they also open a lot of businesses and are just otherwise very entrepreneurial. Now, of course, generally that's sort of the upper caste, the wealthier part of society in Gujarat that does that, but still, the reputation kind of sticks. And they do a fair amount of emigration as well, kind of like the Punjabis do. Yeah, historically, also a very wealthy region because they've historically had a lot of the big trading ports. I think Surat was located there. And they were also the beneficiaries of early industrialization in the 20th century. A lot of the first big textile factories were founded there in Ahmedabad, and you can see that there. Yeah, Mumbai and Ahmedabad were some of the big centers of textiles in India, late 19th century, early 20th century. So Gujarat disproportionately wealthy as a result. And I guess I can kind of go south from there into Maharashtra, where Mumbai is. That used to be called Bombay. So obviously they benefited from having one of the big cities that the British founded there, or at least one of the outposts that turned into a big city. So they're kind of more wealthy as a result, but that's not really a big part of their identity per se. I'd say a bigger part of their identity is like Marathi nationalism. There's a lot of pride in being Marathi there. And that goes back to the Maratha Empire. The last big Hindu empire in Indian history before the British took over was the Maratha Empire. And the Maratha Empire were big rivals of the British while they were establishing control. And because it was mostly because it was mostly an ethnic Maratha empire in origin, ethnic Maratha people in India tend to take disproportionate pride in that sort of heritage. And, to be fair, there's a lot to be proud of. They did some really cool things, especially as far as rejuvenating Hindu culture and pride in the nation's history. But all the same, Marathi nationalism continues as a result of that. It's also worth pointing out here that I guess two things. One, Bollywood is located here. Bollywood started out in Bombay, hence the name Bollywood. And as a result, Marathi culture has somewhat disproportionate representation in Indian media. That's not to say that most of the people and cultures presented in Bollywood movies are Maratha in nature. They actually prefer Punjabis because they're so outgoing and gregarious. They make for better characters, basically. So a lot of the time, they'll use Punjabi. They'll make the characters Punjabi in origin. But because the industry is sort of Marathi in origin, and there's a lot of Marathi people working on the crews and in the industry, there's a little more influence in that regard. So Punjabis and Marathas have disproportionate influence on Indian media for those reasons. And the other thing I was going to mention is that there was a untouchable caste, or at least a lower caste in Maharashtra called the Mulvers or Mulvis. I don't quite remember, but they were particularly discriminated against to the point where there was a mass conversion to Buddhism in the eastern part of the state in the mid-20th century. That was the result of work done by Ambedkar. Ambedkar was one of the leaders of the independence movement in India, and he in particular was a major leader of the untouchables. He himself was actually born an untouchable, and he made it his life's work to try to improve the lot of untouchables in India. So he was a big proponent of reserved seats in parliament for untouchables. He wanted the government to have lots of affirmative action. He wanted the government to invest a lot into untouchable education, this kind of stuff. So he was a big proponent of untouchables, in other words. And he actually converted to Buddhism himself because he didn't think Hinduism was, he basically had no patience for Hinduism. Some people say, it's got some problems, but it's a good religion overall. But he didn't even do that. His attitude was, Hinduism is bad. We're not doing that anymore. I'm converting. So he converted to Buddhism, and he kind of started up his own version of Buddhism almost, from what I was reading. And he traveled to eastern Maharashtra, where some of the poorest and low-caste people were in Maharashtra, and he actually convinced a good chunk of them to convert to his form of Buddhism. And to this day, there's a big Buddhist community there. They're not a majority, but they do make up a disproportionately large chunk of the population. If you look at a list of the second largest religion by district in India, there's this weird Buddhist cluster there that still exists today. So that's Maharashtra. It's an important state and a diverse one. It's probably the one you'll go to if you travel to a major city, since you're probably going to end up going to New Delhi or Mumbai or Chennai. So if you go east from Maharashtra, you see this area in the middle. That's sort of the Deccan. It's this northern part of a big plateau that makes up the bulk of the country. And so from that area all the way east to the coast, roughly, is an area that's disproportionate. Well, I shouldn't say disproportionate. It's depopulated. It's not very populated. There's not a lot of people that live there. Let me put it like this. The population density is much lower in that sort of center right area of India's geography.
Yeah, there are no main cities in this whole area here.
Yeah, there's not a lot of big cities, and most of the big cities there kind of have emerged over the past half century to century. And a disproportionate chunk of the population there is tribal. So these are basically the indigenous peoples of India, what they call the Adivasi, the tribals, basically, in local parlance. And some of them are Hindu, a decent chunk, but in terms of customs and culture and whatnot, they have kind of a different thing going on than the rest of the country. They have not been as Sanskritized as other regions of the country, and their way of life is much older. A lot of them are still hunters and gatherers, although a lot of them have moved into farming in the past 100 or 200 years or so. So it's a relatively undeveloped part of the country, and culturally it's kind of distinct in so much as it's a little more backwards and a little more tribal in nature. So that's Chhattisgarh, eastern Madhya Pradesh, eastern Maharashtra, and then maybe western Odisha, northeastern Andhra Pradesh, and then maybe some of Jharkhand too, although Jharkhand's kind of a special case since they got some of the heavy industry from Bengal that bled over there. But overall, it's relatively poor. I would say, despite having lots of tribals as a large percent of the population, another distinctive feature here is the Naxalites. That's kind of a weird turn of phrase, but basically these are militant communists who are waging red revolution against the state of India and have been for the past 50 years. And if you've never heard of the Naxalites before, no shock, nobody talks about India really. And it's not the aspect of India most people kind of report on when they do stories. But yes, there is in fact a half-century long communist insurgency that the Indian government has been fighting. And the region in which they've mostly been fighting them is in this region that I'm talking about. Part of that is because there's been a lot of discrimination against the local population that's made communism more popular. Because again, tribals and whatnot are kind of considered implicitly low caste, or maybe even untouchables. But then there's also been a lot of mining done in this region, and part of the mining has involved basically stealing land from the locals. They just kind of push them off of it, and a lot of them have not been compensated. And so that's also made communists relatively more popular. So economic development, discrimination, all of that has kind of fed into a certain amount of popularity for the Naxalites. They call them Naxalites because the revolution actually started way up north in a district called Naxal. That was actually northern West Bengal. Have you ever heard of Darjeeling?
The tea, yeah.
Yeah, tea. So that's Naxal district. That's where that started. So when you think of Darjeeling and you think of the tea, keep in mind that the tea plantations there are very oppressive. A lot of the workers there are actually working there as debt slaves and have been for generations. Like when you die, your debt passes on to your children and they have to keep working to work it off.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it's not just like this really cool spiritual place you can go to write a fun book and have a spiritual journey. It's also the site of a significant amount of debt slavery and, yes, militant communism as a result. So the communists there had a lot of support. They tried to revolt. It didn't succeed, but the revolutionaries spread throughout the poorer regions of India that had more backwards castes and tribals like this, and they've been fighting a war there ever since.
Did not know.
But yeah, there's a city there that you can see. I can see your map here, Visakhapatnam. So that city is like the principal port there. And to give you an idea of how historically poor this region is, there's almost never been a major port there in that region that has been a major center of trade. And the only reason Visakhapatnam there is there as a large port, as a large city, is because the British in the 19th century wanted there to be a large port there. They needed there to be a large port there so that they could have easy access to the region, get troops and resources there, and also so that they could use it to project power into the Bay of Bengal, because otherwise all they would have had was Calcutta. Mm-hmm. So the only reason that city is there is specifically because there was nothing there historically. And the Indian government basically continues to pump resources into that city for much the same reason, although they have the added impetus of needing an outlet for raw resources mined in the region. I think there's a big bulk goods port there, the bulk goods terminal, I should say, that they have located in that port. So let's see, if you go south from there, south from that sort of coastal region there in the east, then you run into the rest of Andhra Pradesh. That's always been a poor region. It's historically one of the poorer regions of India. And they've also had a fair amount of experience with communism, but it hasn't been as much as in the northern area there in the state, sort of adjacent to the tribal areas. Yeah, their thing is that they're kind of independent. They've kind of got their own culture. That's where the Reddys are. That's the largest caste group there. I think I mentioned them before. It's kind of tricky. They're sort of, I don't want to say non-entities, but they're not as high profile a region. So I don't know as much about them. I do know that there's an area immediately northwest called Telangana that actually used to be a part of Andhra Pradesh state. And Telangana is really cool because that's where Hyderabad is. That's one of the largest cities in the Deccan Plateau in central India. And the reason that's cool is that it was the site of a major Muslim kingdom. The Mughal Empire was obviously a big Muslim empire, but when it broke up, individual Muslim kingdoms formed that had been sort of the subunits of the Mughal Empire. And one of them was the Nizam of Hyderabad. And so Hyderabad became the site of the largest and most powerful of those splinter Muslim kingdoms. And the Nizam of Hyderabad, at first he fought against the British, like a lot did, but eventually he was incorporated into the British Empire. But unlike a lot of other places, he was allowed to maintain control of his kingdom. He controlled what was called a princely state. So it was part of the British Empire, but it was technically still controlled by a native ruler, again, the Nizam of Hyderabad. And it was easily the largest of all the princely states in India. Like, his kingdom was significant. It took up a good chunk of the southern Deccan there. And it ended up being a pretty good thing because, for one, the Nizam sympathized with the independence movement, but he also wanted to modernize his state. So he invested a lot in education, economic development, and good governance generally, basically. And so the result is that that area there is relatively well developed. I don't know that it necessarily translates into a higher GDP per cap per se, but that area does kind of have its own identity historically. It also has relatively more Muslims than other parts of the South, because Hyderabad was still basically the capital of a Muslim kingdom for so much longer than in other areas. So the reason that state wanted to separate is because they kind of had more of their own identity. Also resources, that's always a popular impetus, but they kind of had their own thing going on, and they'd actually originally wanted to become a separate state way back in the mid-20th century, but the movement was never able to get enough support, basically, in order to kind of get enough votes to make it happen. But then a couple of years ago, they did. There was a separatist party that was able to kind of win the districts there, and they negotiated a split. So now it's its own state, and they kind of have their own little thing there. So that's separate from then Andhra Pradesh, which is majority Hindu and is mostly rural agricultural, and kind of has a separate history as being more part of Madras presidency, which actually was directly ruled by the British. So if you go further south than that, you'll get Tamil Nadu, and the Tamil Nadu is one of my favorite states because they have such a cool identity. For one, they easily have the strongest regionalist party. Like, of all the states in India, which have regionalist parties that advocate, for their own identity separate from like the main nationalist Indian identity, Tamil Nadu has the strongest party. And really, they always have had the strongest party, going all the way back to the initial emergence of Indian nationalism in the 19th century. One of the first regionalist movements to emerge was the Dravidian movement. People in the south of India are generally referred to as Dravidians. And they kind of have their own language, their own culture. It's mostly the same. All of the major beats are there as far as like Hinduism and the ideas they're in. But in terms of language and literature, they have a separate lineage from the rest of India, and they're quite proud of it. And they've been proud of it for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. And when nationalism was introduced to India, Tamil nationalism was like easily one of the first regional nationalisms to emerge, right next to Bengali nationalism. So regionalist Tamil parties emerged very quickly, and after independence, they didn't necessarily have majority support. Congress easily got all the votes after independence, because of course that was the party that got them free of the British. But it didn't take very long for Tamil nationalism to become the main political issue in the state. Like, they wanted to order. One of the big things that happened in the 1950s in India is that there was a big push to redesign the provinces, because the provinces were designed in a way that largely reflected how they'd been under the British. But local regionalist nationalists wanted the borders to be redesigned around linguistics. They wanted all of the states to basically be linguistically uniform. And so the Tamils in particular wanted that. So at first, Congress kind of humored them, but didn't really want to do it entirely. And eventually, the local nationalist party, which I believe was called the DMK, which was like, what was it, Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam. I think that's like local Tamil for Tamil country or something. But basically, that party won the next big election. I think it was like in the late 50s, early 60s. And they became one of the first states to have a non-Congress government rule it. And it was just all about Tamil nationalism. That was the main reason it happened. And they've been governed by either the DMK or another nationalist party that was a splinter of the DMK called the AIA DMK. That was the All India ANA, Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam. So one of those two parties has pretty much governed Tamil Nadu almost ever since independence. And again, the baseline campaign platform that both run on is just local nationalism. So it's also worth mentioning here, talking about Tamil Nadu, that it has Chennai, which used to be called Madras, which was one of the big presidencies that the British controlled, and also was one of the major outposts that the British founded in India that turned into a major city. So that's a major economic center of not only Tamil Nadu, but the country as a whole. It's also the major automotive center. That's like their Detroit, basically. So that's an important industrial center there, at least for southern India. There are other parts of India that are more important industrially, but Chennai has definitely made big gains over the past half century or so. Yeah, I would add here, as far as like culture and perceptions, that people in the south of India, and in particular Tamil Nadu, are kind of seen as being more nerdy. They're considered more passive, more reserved. They're more focused on education. They're not quite as considered as lively as people in the north of India. And so they're kind of respected for that. They tend to make up a disproportionate chunk of like IT grads and stuff. I think I read that a majority share of the Indian migrants working in the tech community in the United States are actually from the south of India. Although some of that is because of Bangalore. Actually, I should talk about Bangalore next. But anyway, yeah, the Tamils are kind of seen as being sort of austere and reserved, although they also have a reputation for being passionate. That seemed a little contradictory to me, but apparently both are true at the same time. Go figure, and that's India for you. So if you look northwest of Tamil Nadu, you'll see Karnataka, which is sort of a big southern state. It kind of goes all the way north up to Maharashtra. And sort of in the southeast of Karnataka, you'll see Bengaluru, which used to be called Bangalore. So the significant thing about Karnataka is that it used to be dominated by a princely state called the Kingdom of Mysore, which had a Hindu ruler, as I recall. And he was very similar to the Nizam of Hyderabad in so much as he ruled one of the larger princely states. I think it was the second largest princely state after the Nizam of Hyderabad. And he also invested a lot into his kingdom's education, infrastructure, governance, what have you. And as a result, it's kind of a little bit ahead of other regions. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, somebody please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it was the Prince of Mysore who started the Technical Institute of India. Is that what it was called? Basically, it's the leading technical institute in India, and has been since a long time, going all the way back to like early 20th century. And a huge chunk of India's like tech guys, web designers, programmers, what have you, a huge chunk of them are graduated from that institution. And in so much as India's economy has been significantly benefiting from the tech sector and technology generally, a big reason that they've been able to take advantage of that has been that institute. So a lot of foresight there on the part of the king of Mysore, rather. And it's been, sort of the pride of India ever since. Now, most of the population in Karnataka doesn't live in around Bangalore. A good chunk does just because it's a bigger city. But most of the population lives along the western coast there. Because the Deccan Plateau in the center of India, it's kind of dry. It's not quite semi-arid, but it's not great for agriculture. It's the land along the coasts is much more fertile. And also, there's mountains called the Ghats that separate the plateau from the coastal lowlands, the Western Ghats and the Eastern Ghats, which separate the Deccan Plateau from the western and eastern coast, respectively. So the coastal lowlands are generally where most of the population lives there, not only in Karnataka, but just like all over India. The coastal lowlands are very, very densely populated. You can see that in any population density map. So that west coast region there for Karnataka probably has the majority of the population. But it's also poorer. They haven't had as much economic development, I don't think. It's a little more rural and agricultural. I would note that Karnataka does not seem to have as much of a regional identity. I'm still learning about India. There's a lot to learn. But, as I've kind of tried to learn different states and stuff, Karnataka seems a little non-distinct. That's not to say that they don't have a Dravidian identity like the rest of southern India. And they do seem to vote for the BJP, so maybe that means there is some Hindutva sentiment there, some support for Hindu policies. But in general, it just seems to be kind of a quiet, competently well-run state overall. It doesn't seem to be a lot of like distinguishing drama that you can point to there. So overall, I would imagine that's to their credit. But beyond that, the only distinctive thing I know right now is that the Kingdom of Mysore was there and that it played a big role in helping to modernize India. So then kind of at the very bottom there, in the southwestern corner of India, is Kerala. And Kerala is going to be your favorite state, Neuro.
Why?
Because it's the most colorful, it's the most interesting, it's got just so much unique about it that makes it stand out. I mean, for one, it was a major center of trade for India. Tamil Nadu was too. A lot of major commercial maritime empires in southern India were based in Tamil Nadu. But Kerala had its own share of trade. A lot of the major cities there have historically been major cities in the Indian Ocean trade network. And so those cities grew up into pretty decently powerful city-states. And they're very similar in many regards to the Italian city-states in the Renaissance, in so much as they all competed with each other and feuded with each other. So that history alone kind of creates a little more similarity there if you're a Westerner, and maybe some affinity if you're interested in Italian city-states. They were also one of the first places Europeans reached, and so there's some influence there as well. But more to the point, Kerala has one of the lowest percentages of its population as Hindus as any state in India. And that's because it was part of that early maritime Indian Ocean trade. Christianity was introduced very early into Kerala, so they built up a pretty strong presence, but especially Islam was introduced very early in the existence of Islam and was introduced along trade networks. So, Islam in the north of India, that was kind of more of a violent thing. There was definitely peaceful conversions. I don't want to badmouth Islam in India. They get enough of that already. But in general, there was a lot of big Islamic invasions, and a lot of conversions were by force, and it was kind of ugly. But Islam's introduction into southern India, and specifically Kerala, was much more peaceful. And it has a really cool, solid history as being like a genuinely peaceful religion there in Kerala. Like, easily that's the standout example as far as like peaceful expansion of Islam. And they make up a good chunk of the population even today, even though it's not nearly as important economically as it was like hundreds of years ago. I think it's something like roughly, I'm going to say like 20 to 25% of the population is Muslim, and then slightly less of that is going to be Christian. So almost half of the population is either Christian or Muslim, and that alone makes the state unique. Easily it's the largest Christian population as a proportion of the population in India, outside of the Northeast. That's the whole other thing. But yeah, as far as like built up large populated states, Kerala is one of the largest in that regard. And I think it's only like maybe 50% Hindu or so. So that alone makes it very diverse, and it kind of gives the culture there a unique feeling. Although they also still have caste and stuff, caste discrimination within the context of Islam and Christianity, like I said earlier, is still a thing there. But it also makes them a little more resistant to caste. I should point out here, southern India in general has a very different history with caste than northern India. Like in northern India, you've got castes that roughly fall into like the four original categories: Brahmin, Vaishya, Shudra, and Kshatriya, right? But in southern India, mostly it's just Brahmins and Shudras. It's mostly like the top of the caste hierarchy and then the bottom. And that's because historically they didn't really have as many castes, and still to this day don't have as many castes as the north, and historically have not had the caste system be as important a social institution. It's still there, it's still important, it's still impactful, but it's notably less so than in the northern part of India. And part of that manifests in terms of the lower number of castes and also the less prevalent caste politics, although caste politics are also still important. But Kerala in particular epitomizes this sort of southern distinction as far as caste, because in the 19th century, Kerala was governed by a princely state, again, but it was easily one of the most modern in India, because the guy that ran the princely state, which at the time was called Travancore, the guy that ran Travancore in the 19th century really wanted to modernize it, and he actually went out of his way to do that. To the point where he was able to modernize, again, kind of like, Hyderabad and Mysore. He was able to modernize governance, and but he was able to take it a step further. And actually, as early as the maybe even early 19th century, Travancore had a relatively modern European administration, which, as far as I know, was much earlier than any of the other kingdoms in India. He was also able to build up a pretty decent-sized navy, which I think was able to at one point defeat a European navy, like in the late 1700s. That was sort of earlier on in the process, but he was able to kind of do that. So that's also impressive. Indian nationalists always love stuff like that. So in addition to that, Kerala was the site of a major social reform movement in the mid-19th century that went into the later, basically runs up till now, that really, really hated caste and caste discrimination. That was one of their principal targets. Among other things, they had other things they wanted to do, but the battle against caste discrimination on the part of this movement was particularly notable. So as a result, even amongst southern Indian states where caste is sort of looked down, well, is not as much of a part of the society, Kerala in particular has gone after caste, like explicitly gone to war with it in the past in the form of politics and social movements. And so that did not necessarily translate into equality because even though there was this big social reform movement, most of the land was disproportionate. Well, I should say the land in Kerala was disproportionately owned by Brahmins, upper caste people. I think specifically in Kerala's case, it was Nambudiri Brahmins. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Uh, but they owned a good chunk of the land, and that upset a lot of people. So the result was a land reform movement, which met a lot of opposition from the big landowners. So you have a country, well, you have a state here where there's a lot of land inequality, a mixed success land reform movement, and a population that is disproportionately aligned towards social reform, liberalism, and modernity. So what does that mean, Neuro?
Means that they're not going to be quite as gung-ho with the Hindu nationalism stuff?
Well, that, but more specifically, communism.
Oh.
Communism became very popular in Kerala because no ideology really epitomized that desire to change the status quo and go to war with caste and other social evils in the state than communism. It's a little paradoxical given how many Christians and Muslims there are, but that's how it panned out. The communists won big in Kerala as early as the late 1950s. They were one of the first states they were able to win power in. And they've effectively dominated the state's politics ever since. I think now it's technically called the Left Democratic Front or something, or the Left Coalition, but regardless, it's basically just a coalition of communist parties in Kerala. And they've been running the state like it's their own personal fiefdom, for much of the past half century. And that, the backdrop to that is that land inequality, but also social equality. That's like a big, that's a big norm there in Kerala. And that's not to say that, Kerala doesn't have some caste problems. I don't want to oversell the point here. But among all the states, like easily they've been the most dedicated to that from what I've read thus far. And that alone, just along with all the other stuff, just makes them a very, very unique state in India. And it's a lot of fun reading about them. And even as an economist, I've read about Kerala because when you read about, if you study development economics, you'll see different metrics by which to measure development. And one of them is the HDI, the Human Development Index. And the Human Development Index does not measure production like GDP does. Rather, it tries to measure quality of life, which is kind of amorphous, but there are different metrics you can use to try to estimate a number by which you can try to compare quality of life across geographies. And even though Kerala is not a very wealthy state in terms of GDP or GDP per capita, it's actually got one of, if not the highest HDI in India. And it's actually one of the higher ones in the world. It's actually on par with a lot of developed countries. It's actually a really impressive feat for a territory as poor as Kerala to be able to pull that off. And it's a very rare example of that. I don't think there's really even any other examples of that, at least not on a scale as large as Kerala. So you can chalk that up to policies pushing equality and equity, more investment in education, or maybe it's just a result of the inherent Southern Indian desire to educate people and to have strong institutions. You can credit it to different things, but regardless, it's the case that for a state that poor, it's got weirdly high quality of life, and it's just a really cool example of that.
Yeah. And I think the three-way split of religion is likely something that just lowers the overall power share of whatever the majority group is, which is going to reward things like accepting diversity and being inclusive of people who don't have your same beliefs and stuff, because if you want to have traction in your community, you want to be able to communicate with all the different kinds of groups.
Yeah, pretty handy in that regard. But that's most of India. There's also some states like along the Himalayas, but those are basically unique cultures, generally more Buddhist in nature. Although I think Himachal Pradesh is actually more Hindu. It kind of shifts towards more Hindu the closer you get to Kashmir. And of course, Kashmir is its own thing. But I think most people are familiar with the Kashmir drama at this point. So maybe that doesn't bear repeating. And then the northeastern part of the state is probably the most distinctive from the rest of it, because the people there are actually Asians, or, well, I should say they look Asian. Most people in India look almost Western to a degree, but they have a distinctive Indian look. But you wouldn't say they looked Asian. But the people in the northeastern part of the state actually do. That sort of the ethnic groups up there are more Asiatic in genetics, so to speak.
Yeah, in India, it kind of squeaks between Bangladesh and Bhutan and has people
Yeah.
over here.
Yeah, similar deal. All of those are sort of more Asian in physicality. Assam is probably the most developed of the states there, and in terms of history, they've also got the most civilization, so to speak. They really had their own Assam kingdom for much of the past couple thousand years. Sometimes it broke up, but more or less, there's almost always been a single kingdom controlling that territory. And the really cool thing about them is that they've been able to survive a lot. Like the British, they survived the British Raj, they survived the Hindus, they survived the Buddhists, and they also, more impressively, survived the Mughal Empire. Like there were very few parts of India that were able to survive attacks by the Mughal emperor, especially when the empire was at its height in the 1600s. But Assam was actually one of them, and that's something for which Assam nationalists have been very proud of ever since. So a very neat achievement there. They've also got a very strong nationalist movement. Unfortunately, it's also historically been a very violent militant movement. One of the first militant separatist movements in post-independence India started up in Assam, and the Indian government had to fight them for several decades. I think it was only in the past 15, 20 years that the government was able to kind of reach a satisfactory peace deal that could get them to lay down arms. So peace is a relatively modern thing in Assam as a result. They've also got no small amount of chauvinism towards some Bengalis who migrate there. They believe that Assam should be for the ethnic Assam population, so they don't particularly appreciate ethnic Bengalis coming across the border and settling there and changing the demographics. Mm-hmm. Although, interestingly, they also don't really get along with the tribal groups in the other little states that are around Assam. So there's kind of a three-way political ethnic battle between the Assamese, the tribal groups, and then the Bengalis in Assam, which has come up a lot in Indian politics over the past 10, 20 years in particular. Yeah, those little groups there, well, I should say the Assamese tend to be more Hindu, although they have a lot of, they have some Muslims and Christians as well. But these little states here, you see, like Meghalaya, Manipur, Nagaland, these are sort of more the tribal groups, and there's very little development. They're not well integrated into the Indian economy or even necessarily the Indian national identity that much. They really are more like frontier people, like what you would see in northern Burma almost. And the interesting thing about them, besides the fact that they're, not very developed, is the fact that they're disproportionately Christian. Almost all of those are majority Christian populations at this point, or are very close to being majority Christian populations. And that's because, being on the fringe of Indian civilization, they were not integrated into the Hindu religion. And the Muslims never got to them because they were up in hills and stuff, so it was just hard to get to them, and there wasn't much economic incentive to invade those areas. Mm-hmm. So going into the 19th century, then, they were kind of up for grabs, so to speak, religiously speaking. And so Christian missionaries took the opportunity to move into that market and dominate it. And they've been working it ever since. And the result is that they've been very successful in Christianizing the people of this region. So alone amongst the regions of India, this is the one area where there are significant majority Christian populations that can be said to be the majority in the state, specifically. Still very poor, but just unique.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. We got a heckin' regional overview of India as well for this India episode.
Yeah, India really is not a country. It's a civilization. It's really just Europe, if Europe would integrate into under a single government. That's basically what India is, which is why it takes so long to even just go through the regions and describe the culture. It is its own animal. It has its own customs, civilizational history, norms, literature, all of it. It's got everything you would associate with a civilization. Mm-hmm. And it's got an immense amount of diversity. It's actually much more diverse than, say, China, which has a similar population, but which really only ever had one civilizational pole. Basically China started out in the Western Way river basin, coming out of the Los Plateau, and then it just expanded out and expanded and expanded until it reached present day borders. Mm-hmm. So that was the civilization, and then it just spread. Whereas in India, you had multiple civilizations all merging together, over time. So that's why it's much more complex and much more complicated to learn about.
Well, hell yeah. I like this format of episode 2 where instead of going through a bunch of different random news items, we hit one location, get to go a lot further with it.
Well, it's hard to do, week after week because there's only so many regions in the world, and I only know so much about so many. India and China in particular, I've been focusing on the past 10 years or so I know more about them. But if you ask me to like jump into the Middle East, I could talk for a while about them, but I wouldn't be able to go into as much depth. Yeah. I could try, but it's a tall order. The current event stuff acts as a nice pad.
Yeah.
Gives me a nice buffer.
Something we can always fall back on is the big headlines and what's actually going on. Well, cool. We went a little bit over today.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's good. I didn't want to stop you because you were starting to go through the regions and it was really good and I was learning a lot too. So we got the Story of India Agent Smith edition this evening.
My best effort anyway. I'm sure there's corrections and stuff I missed, but yeah. I try to give you a...
If you are Indian or you have family who is from India and so on and you have some perspectives to share in the YouTube comments, feel free to do so. If we said some stuff wrong and you want to correct us, feel free. We are also here trying to learn.
Oh, that's correct. Yeah, very much so.
When's the next time he comes? We do this every Saturday, 6 p.m. Pacific time-ish. Emphasis on the ish.
Ish, yeah.
And these all get posted to YouTube.
Not always as much depth as today, but yeah, this is kind of what we aim for anyway.
Well, cool. I need to get some food, but I appreciate your hustle as always, Mr. Agent Smith.
Oh, no. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. Always much appreciated. It's a privilege to be here.
Hell yeah. And thank you, chat, for weighing in and participating in this episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. See you next time.
Nice.